Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete and peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Queen Mary II, a woman whose delicate balance of loyalty, faith, and power helped shape the very foundation of modern Britain. Born in 1662 into a world of royal intrigue and religious turmoil, Mary would grow from a privileged yet lonely princess into one of England's most beloved monarchs. Tonight, we'll softly explore her entire life story, from her childhood in the glittering courts of Restoration England, through her unexpected love story with William of Orange, to her pivotal role in the glorious revolution that peacefully transformed a nation. This is a tale of duty over desire, of sisterly bonds tested by politics, and of a woman who never sought power but wielded it with grace when called upon. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you. Even if you're usually a bit shy, leave a gentle comment below about which royal figure you'd like to hear about next, or simply share what drew you to Mary's story. Your thoughts truly mean the world to me and help shape future episodes. And if you enjoy these calming historical tales, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. It helps more history lovers find their way to our cozy corner of YouTube. So snuggle deep into your blankets, close your eyes, and let the soft whispers of 17th century England lull you into restful sleep. Over the next 3 hours, we'll walk together through palaces and gardens, witness history's turning points, and discover the gentle strength of a queen who changed everything. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. We're so glad you're here. Now, let us begin. Mary, later known as Queen Mary II of England, Scotland, and Ireland, entered the world on a spring morning when the blossoms were just beginning to unfold across London. On the 30th day of April in the year 1662, at St. James's Palace, a daughter was born to James, Duke of York, and his wife Anne Hyde. The bells of London rang out to announce her arrival, though they rang with somewhat less enthusiasm than they might have for a boy. Still, this tiny princess, swaddled in silk and lace, represented hope and continuity for a royal family that had only recently been restored to power after years of tumultuous civil war. The England into which Mary was born was a nation still healing from deep wounds. Only 2 years earlier, her uncle Charles II had returned from exile to reclaim his father's throne, ending the stern rule of Oliver Cromwell and the Puritan Commonwealth. The Restoration, as this glorious return was called, had brought back not just monarchy, but music, theatre, colour, and celebration to a land that had been draped in sombre black for more than a decade. The court once again sparkled with elaborate gowns, flowing wigs, and the sound of violins drifting through candlelit chambers. St. James's Palace, where Mary drew her first breath, stood as a testament to Tudor grandeur, its red brick walls and twisted chimneys rising above the London skyline. Built by King Henry VIII over a century before, it had served as a royal residence for generations. The room where Mary was born would have been warm despite the spring air outside, heated by a great fireplace and illuminated by beeswax candles that cast dancing shadows on the tapestried walls. Her mother, Anne Hyde, lay exhausted in the great bed, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and midwives who fussed and cooed over the newborn princess. Anne Hyde was herself a remarkable woman, though her story is often overshadowed by those of her famous daughters. She was not born royal. Her father was Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, who served as Lord Chancellor to Charles II and had been instrumental in the restoration of the monarchy. Anne had served as a maid of honour to James's sister, Princess Mary of Orange, and it was during this service that James had fallen in love with her. Their romance had been scandalous, for James was the heir presumptive to the throne, and Anne was merely the daughter of a commoner. However elevated her father's position, they had married secretly in 1660, and when Anne's pregnancy became apparent, the marriage was reluctantly acknowledged by the royal family. Mary's father, James, Duke of York, was a complex figure who would loom large over his daughter's destiny. He was Charles II's younger brother, and since Charles had no legitimate children, James stood next in line for the throne. James was a naval man, brave and competent, who had commanded fleets and won battles against the Dutch. He was also deeply devout, and in the coming years, his religious convictions would set the stage for the dramatic events that would define Mary's life. But in 1662, when Mary was born, James was still outwardly conforming to the Anglican faith, though whispers already circulated about his Catholic sympathies. The baby Mary was baptized in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, christened with water from the River Jordan, in a ceremony that glittered with royal pageantry. She was named after her paternal aunt, Mary, Princess of Orange, who had died the previous year, and also after her great-great-grandmother Mary, Queen of Scots, that tragic and romantic figure whose life had ended on the executioner's block. Little could anyone imagine that this new Mary would one day face her own terrible choice between family loyalty and the demands of her crown. In these early days, Mary was second in line to the throne, after her father. This was an unusual position for a girl child, in an age when male heirs were so desperately prized. Yet her uncle Charles seemed unable to father legitimate children, despite his numerous mistresses and acknowledged bastards. This meant that the succession would likely pass through James's line, and Mary, as his eldest child, held great significance. The palace where Mary spent her first years was a world of whispered conversations, rustling silk, and the constant presence of servants. Royal babies were not raised by their parents in the intimate way that common children were. Mary would have been placed in the care of wet nurses and rockers, women whose job it was to tend to her every physical need. As she grew from infant to toddler, governesses would take over her education and daily supervision. She would see her parents primarily during formal visits, carefully arranged occasions when she would be brought to them, dressed in miniature court gowns to make her curtsy and receive their blessing. Yet despite this formal distance, there are indications that James was fond of his eldest daughter. He would later show clear favoritism toward Mary over her younger sister Anne, perhaps because Mary was the firstborn, or perhaps because there was something in her temperament that appealed to him. Mary was described even as a child as being gentle, sweet-natured, and eager to please, qualities that would serve her both well and poorly in the complicated years ahead. The court of Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch, was a place of remarkable contrasts. On one hand, it was brilliantly sophisticated, attracting poets, playwrights, scientists, and artists. Samuel Pepys kept his famous diary during these years, recording the gossip and scandals of the age. John Dryden wrote his verses. Christopher Wren began rebuilding London's churches after the Great Fire of 1666. On the other hand, the court was also notorious for its licentiousness and immorality. Charles himself kept numerous mistresses, most famously Nell Gwynn, the orange seller turned actress. Gambling, drinking, and sexual intrigue were commonplace. This was the world into which Mary was born. A world of both Renaissance and decadence, where scientific discovery coexisted with superstition, where great art flourished alongside great vice, and hovering over everything was the memory of the Civil War that had torn England apart just a generation before, when King had fought against Parliament, when father had fought against son, when the very fabric of society had been ripped asunder. Mary's earliest years coincided with several disasters that struck London and the nation. In 1665, when she was just 3 years old, the Great Plague swept through the city, killing perhaps 100,000 people. The court fled to Oxford, and Mary would have been hustled away with her household, kept safe from the pestilence that turned London into a city of death carts and plague pits. Then, in September 1666, the Great Fire of London consumed much of the medieval city, burning for 4 days and nights, destroying thousands of homes and dozens of churches, including the old St. Paul's Cathedral. Mary was too young to understand these catastrophes fully, but they were part of the backdrop of her childhood, reminding everyone of life's fragility and uncertainty. As Mary grew from baby to little girl, she was not alone. Her mother, Anne Hyde, was remarkably fertile, giving birth to 8 children in quick succession. But 17th century childhood was perilous, and disease took a terrible toll on the royal nursery. Mary's younger siblings died one by one in infancy or early childhood. James, Duke of Cambridge, died at 4. Charles, Duke of Kendal, died as an infant. Edgar, Duke of Cambridge, at 1 year old. Henrietta, at 3 months. Catherine, at 9 months. Only Mary and her younger sister Anne, born in 1665, would survive to adulthood. This parade of tiny coffins, of siblings who arrived and departed before Mary could truly know them, must have cast a shadow over her young life. In an age when childhood death was common, it was still deeply felt, and Mary would grow up with an acute awareness of mortality. Perhaps this is why, in her later years, she would be so devout, so focused on the spiritual realm, so concerned with matters of the soul. When you grow up watching babies die, when you attend their small funerals and see their tiny bodies laid in the ground, you cannot help but think deeply about the meaning of life and what, if anything, lies beyond. The royal nursery would have been a place of quiet now, with only Mary and little Anne left. The 2 sisters, just 3 years apart in age, would grow close during these early years, bound together by loss and by their unique position as royal daughters. They would play together in the palace gardens, learning their letters from tutors, practicing their curtsies and court manners. They were dressed alike in miniature versions of adult fashion, long gowns, tight bodices, and elaborate hairstyles that must have been uncomfortable for small children. Portraits from this period show them as solemn little figures, posed formally with the symbols of royalty around them. Despite the losses and the formality, there were moments of childhood joy. Mary loved music and would learn to play the harpsichord and the lute. She enjoyed dancing and would later excel at it, taking part in court ballets and masques. She learned French, which was the language of diplomacy and culture, and she became fluent in it. She was taught to read and write in English, though her education in other subjects was limited. Arithmetic, geography, history were all touched upon, but not deeply studied. For a girl, even a princess, too much learning was considered unfeminine and unnecessary. But Mary was bright and curious, and she loved to read. She would develop a passion for books that would last her entire life, collecting volumes and spending hours absorbed in reading. This love of learning, pursued quietly in her private chambers away from the public eye, would help her later when she needed to understand complex political and religious matters as queen. As Mary approached her 10th year, her world would be shattered by an event that would reshape her entire life. But before that terrible blow fell, she had these early years, years of relative innocence, of sisterly companionship, of lessons and games and the slow rhythm of palace life. She was a princess of England, second in line to the throne, beloved by her father, and blissfully unaware of the storms that were gathering on the horizon. The seeds of future conflict were already being sown, though Mary could not know it. Her father's religious inclinations were becoming more pronounced. Her uncle, the king, though officially head of the Church of England, was known to have Catholic sympathies. The nation was divided between those who supported the established Anglican Church and those who practiced other forms of Christianity, as well as a small but influential Catholic minority. Politics and religion were inseparably intertwined, and Mary would one day find herself at the very center of these conflicts, forced to choose between loyalty to her father and loyalty to her faith and her nation. But for now, in these early years of the 1660s and early 1670s, Mary was simply a little girl, learning to navigate the complex world of the royal court, finding comfort in her sister's companionship, taking pride in her accomplishments, and trying to please the demanding adults who surrounded her. She was learning the art of being royal, the posture, the dignity, the careful control of emotion. She was learning that a princess must always be gracious, always be proper, always put duty before personal desire. These lessons, learned so young, would never leave her. Throughout her life, Mary would struggle with the conflict between what she wanted and what was expected of her. She would choose duty over happiness again and again. And in the end, this dedication to duty would both define and destroy parts of her, even as it made her into one of England's most beloved queens. The gentle rhythm of Mary's childhood was irrevocably shattered on a cold March evening in 1671. Mary was not yet 9 years old when her mother, Anne Hyde, Duchess of York, took to her bed with what would prove to be her final illness. The breast cancer that had been growing silently within Anne's body now revealed itself with terrible swiftness, and within weeks, the vigorous woman, who had borne 8 children and navigated the treacherous waters of court politics with such skill, was reduced to a suffering shadow. The palace physicians could do nothing. Their treatments, bleeding, purges, poultices, only added to Anne's misery without slowing the disease's relentless progress. In that era before anesthesia or antibiotics, before any real understanding of disease, death was an infrequent visitor, and people had learned to face it with as much courage and faith as they could muster. Anne Hyde faced it with remarkable dignity, settling her affairs and making her peace with God according to the Catholic faith she had adopted in secret some years before. Mary and her sister Anne were kept away from their mother's sick room during the worst of the illness. It was thought inappropriate for children, especially girls, to witness such suffering, but they knew something terrible was happening. They could hear the hurried footsteps of servants and physicians in the corridors, could see the grave faces of the adults around them, could feel the atmosphere of dread that had settled over the household. And then, on the 31st of March, 1671, their mother was gone. The death of a parent is perhaps the defining tragedy of childhood, and Mary felt it deeply. Anne Hyde had not been a demonstratively affectionate mother. Royal parents rarely were, but she had been a stable presence, a source of authority and comfort. Now that presence was gone, and Mary found herself in a world that suddenly felt much colder and more uncertain. She and her sister Anne clung to each other during this dark time, their bond strengthening in the face of shared loss. The funeral was conducted with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a duchess. Anne Hyde's body lay in state, and then was buried at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that Mary was considered too young to attend, but she would have worn mourning black for many months afterward, a constant visual reminder of her loss. In portraits from this period, Mary appears as a somber little figure, her dark eyes seeming older than her years. With their mother gone, Mary and Anne's upbringing fell more directly under the supervision of their uncle, King Charles II, and their father James. This might seem like a favourable situation, What could be better than having a king take personal interest in your education? But Charles had his own agenda, and it would prove to have profound implications for both girls. The king was acutely aware of the religious tensions simmering beneath the surface of English society. Although he had been restored to the throne with much celebration and goodwill, that goodwill was contingent on his remaining Protestant. England had fought a civil war partly over fears of Catholic influence, and Parliament and the people remained deeply suspicious of anything that smacked of popery. Charles himself had Catholic sympathies. He would convert on his deathbed, but he was too politically astute to convert openly while he lived. James, Duke of York, however, was less subtle. In 1668 or 1669, he had converted to Roman Catholicism, and by 1673, with the passage of the Test Act, his conversion became public knowledge. This caused an enormous scandal and created a constitutional crisis. James was heir to the throne, and the prospect of a Catholic king horrified many English Protestants. Various political factions attempted to exclude James from the succession, leading to years of parliamentary battles and popular unrest. It was in this fraught context that Charles made a fateful decision regarding his nieces. Despite the Catholic faith of both their parents, Mary and Anne would be raised as devout Anglicans. They were not even to live with their father, but were instead removed to Richmond Palace, where they would be supervised by governesses chosen for their impeccable Protestant credentials. This was Charles's insurance policy. Even if James inherited the throne as a Catholic, his daughters and heirs were safely Protestant, which would reassure Parliament and the people that Catholicism would not become permanently established. For Mary and Anne, this meant a childhood lived somewhat apart from their family. Richmond Palace, sitting beside the River Thames, surrounded by deer parks and gardens, became their primary home. It was a beautiful place, tranquil and somewhat rural compared to the bustle of London, but it must have felt isolating for two young girls who had already lost their mother and were now separated from their father as well. Their governess was Lady Frances Villiers, a woman of strict principles and firm religious convictions. She oversaw every aspect of the girls' education and daily life, ensuring that they were brought up as proper Protestant princesses. They attended Anglican services regularly, learned their catechism, and were steeped in the theology and practices of the Church of England. This religious education would prove crucial in Mary's later life, shaping her worldview and giving her the conviction to make difficult choices. But despite the formality and religious rigidity of their upbringing, Mary and Anne found ways to be children. They played together in the gardens, chasing each other through the knot gardens and hiding among the hedges. They learned to dance, and Mary in particular showed great talent and grace in movement. They were taught to play musical instruments, Mary the harpsichord and virginals, Anne the flute. They learned embroidery, working intricate patterns with silk thread on linen. They read books, played cards, and on special occasions, watched plays performed by travelling companies of actors. During these years at Richmond, Mary also developed an intense friendship with an older girl named Frances Apsley, the daughter of one of the courtiers. This friendship took on an almost romantic character, with Mary writing passionate letters to Frances, in which she adopted male nicknames and the Frances took female ones. Mary called herself Mary Chlorine, and Frances Aurelia. The letters, which survive, are filled with declarations of love and devotion that seem startling to modern readers. "I love you with a passion of ye greatest prince," Mary wrote at age 14. Such passionate friendships between women were not uncommon in this era and were generally accepted as a phase of adolescent development. Mary's attachment to Frances Apsley was probably innocent, though it demonstrates the intensity of feeling that Mary was capable of, and perhaps also reflects her hunger for emotional connection in a childhood. marked by loss and separation. Francis eventually grew uncomfortable with the intensity of Mary's affections and began to respond more formally to her letters, which distressed Mary greatly, but also taught her something about the pain of unrequited love. In 1673, when Mary was 11, her father remarried. His new bride was Mary of Modena, a beautiful Italian princess who was only 15 years old, barely older than Mary herself. This marriage was deeply unpopular in England because Mary of Modena was Catholic, and it seemed to confirm James's commitment to his faith. Parliament was outraged, and the people murmured darkly about papist plots and foreign influence. For Mary and Anne, their father's remarriage was strange and unsettling. Here was a stepmother who was young enough to be their sister, who spoke with an Italian accent, who practiced a religion they had been taught to view with suspicion. Mary of Modena was kind-hearted and well-meaning, but the situation was awkward for everyone. The girls remained at Richmond rather than moving into their father's household, so they saw their stepmother only on formal visits. These visits were increasingly tense affairs. James wanted his daughters to be part of his Catholic household, but Charles was adamant that they remain with their Protestant guardians. The girls found themselves caught in the middle of this religious and political struggle, expected to show respect and affection to a father whose faith was condemned by their tutors and guardians. It was a confusing position for children to navigate, and it must have been emotionally exhausting. During these middle years of childhood, from ages 9 to 15, Mary was shaped by several powerful forces. First, there was the absence of a mother's love and the corresponding closeness with her sister Anne, who became her primary emotional attachment. Second, there was the strict Protestant education, overseen by Lady Frances Villiers and approved by King Charles, which instilled in Mary a deep devotion to the Church of England and a corresponding suspicion of Catholicism. Third, there was the growing distance from her father, whose religious and political choices were driving a wedge between them, even as she still loved and wanted to please him. Mary was also developing into a young woman during these years, and her physical appearance attracted much attention. She grew tall, remarkably tall for a woman of that era, eventually reaching 5 feet 11 inches. She had dark hair, pale skin, and large, expressive eyes. Contemporaries described her as beautiful, with a natural grace and dignity that made her stand out at court. She learned to carry herself like a princess, with perfect posture and smooth movements. She mastered the elaborate court dances of the period and could make a curtsy so deep and perfect that it was praised by all who saw it. But beneath this poised exterior, Mary was developing an interior life of some complexity. She was naturally shy and somewhat retiring, preferring quiet pursuits to the gossip and intrigue of court. She loved to read, particularly works of piety and moral instruction, though she also enjoyed romances and plays. She had a strong sense of duty and took seriously her obligations as a royal princess, and she had a deep streak of self-doubt and anxiety, constantly worrying about whether she was good enough, pious enough, obedient enough. Her education, while more extensive than what most girls received, was still limited by the standards of the time. She learned French fluently and could speak it like a native. She learned Dutch as well, though not until after her marriage. She could read and write in English with ease and had beautiful handwriting. She understood enough Latin to follow religious services and could read simple texts. She learned some history, particularly the history of England and the royal family. She learned geography from maps and globes, but she received no training in mathematics beyond basic arithmetic, no science, no philosophy in the academic sense. What Mary did receive was extensive training in the art of being royal. She learned how to behave in every social situation, how to speak to people of different ranks, how to maintain her dignity without seeming haughty, how to be gracious and charming while revealing nothing of her true feelings. She learned the complex rituals and etiquette of the court, when to bow and when to curtsy, how to dress appropriately for each occasion, how to eat properly at a formal banquet. These skills might seem superficial, but they were actually crucial for someone in her position. A princess who violated court protocol or behaved inappropriately could cause political incidents and damage diplomatic relations. As Mary moved through her teenage years, speculation about her marriage began to intensify. She was second in line to the English throne, which made her one of the most desirable brides in Europe. Various princes and kings approached her father and uncle with marriage proposals. Mary herself had little say in the matter. Royal marriages were affairs of state, not romantic love matches. She understood that she would marry whoever was chosen for her, and she tried to prepare herself emotionally for the prospect of leaving England and going to live among strangers. The marriage that was eventually arranged for her would take her to the Netherlands and into the arms of a man she had never met, her cousin William of Orange. But before that momentous event, Mary had these years at Richmond, years of study and prayer, of sisterly companionship, of slowly growing into her role and her destiny. She was being forged by loss and loneliness, by duty and devotion, into someone who would one day be strong enough to make the hardest choice any daughter could face, to stand against her own father in defense of her faith and her nation. Looking back on these childhood years, we can see how they shaped the woman Mary would become. The loss of her mother made her vulnerable and hungry for love, but also resilient and self-reliant. The separation from her father created both loyalty and independence. She loved him, but learned she could not always depend on him. Her strict Protestant education gave her a set of principles she would hold to fiercely, even when they cost her dearly. Her friendship with Anne created a bond that would survive many tests, though ultimately it too would be strained nearly to breaking by the demands of politics and power. Mary was growing up in the shadow of history, preparing for a role she couldn't yet imagine. And as she moved toward her 15th year, her childhood was about to end abruptly. A marriage had been arranged, and whether she was ready or not, Mary was about to become a wife, a princess of a foreign land, and eventually a queen. The autumn of 1677 brought with it not just falling leaves and cooling temperatures, but also a momentous change in Mary's life that would alter her course forever. She was 15 years old, an age when girls of her time were often considered ready for marriage, but Mary herself felt anything but ready. She had been raised with the understanding that duty must come before personal desire, that royal marriages were matters of state rather than matters of the heart. Yet nothing could truly prepare her for the emotional reality of leaving everything she knew to marry a stranger. The marriage had been orchestrated primarily by King Charles II and his chief minister, the Earl of Danby. Their motivation was political through and through. England needed an alliance with the Dutch Republic against the growing power of Louis XIV's France. The Dutch needed English support in their ongoing struggle to maintain independence from French domination. And conveniently, there was an eligible bachelor in the Netherlands who happened to be Mary's cousin, William, Prince of Orange, Stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland. William of Orange was 27 years old, 12 years Mary's senior, and already a figure of considerable importance in European politics. He was the posthumous son of William II of Orange and Mary, Princess Royal of England, making him the grandson of King Charles I, and thus doubly Mary's cousin. He had grown up during troubled times, watching his country fight for survival against the might of France, and he had devoted his entire adult life to opposing Louis XIV's ambitions. He was a skilled military commander, a shrewd politician, and utterly committed to the Protestant cause. But William was not what one might call a romantic figure. He was short, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a slight, almost frail build and a hunched back. A childhood bout of smallpox had left his complexion mottled and scarred. He suffered from asthma and chronic coughs that made him wheeze and gasp, especially in damp weather. His nose was prominent and hooked, his eyes small and piercing. He dressed simply, usually in dark colours, eschewing the elaborate wigs and lace that were fashionable at the English court. He had no interest in theatre, dancing, or most forms of entertainment. He went to bed early, rose early, and spent his days working with a single-minded intensity that left little room for pleasure. In short, he was everything that a romantic-minded 15-year-old girl might find disappointing in a prospective husband. And Mary, for all her training in duty and obedience, was still just that, a girl who had grown up reading romances and probably dreaming of a handsome prince who would sweep her off her feet. The negotiations for the marriage were conducted during the summer and early autumn of 1677, with Mary having no voice in the discussions. Her father James initially opposed the match, not wanting to ally his daughter with a Protestant prince who was known for his staunch anti-Catholic stance. But Charles II overruled his brother, seeing the political advantage too clearly to pass up. William himself came to England in October to finalise the arrangements and to meet his intended bride. The first meeting between Mary and William took place at Whitehall Palace, and it was not, by any account, a romantic encounter. William arrived fresh from his journey, dressed in his usual plain clothes, his manner brusque and businesslike. He looked at Mary appraisingly, noting her height. She was actually taller than he was by several inches, and her beauty. She looked at him and tried to hide her dismay. This was the man she was to marry, this short, hunched, rather plain-looking stranger who showed no warmth or charm. After the briefest of introductions, William went immediately to discuss matters of state with King Charles and Mary's father, leaving Mary to retreat to her chambers where, according to contemporary accounts, she wept bitterly for hours. She confided in her sister Anne, who tried to comfort her, but could offer little real consolation. Anne, only 12 years old herself, could only share in her sister's distress at this unwelcome turn of events. The wedding was scheduled with almost indecent haste. Once the political agreement was reached and the marriage contract signed, there was no reason to delay. The ceremony would take place on November 4th, 1677, giving Mary barely 2 weeks to accustom herself to the idea of becoming a wife. These 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Gowns were made, jewels selected, arrangements finalized. Mary went through it all in a state of numb resignation, fulfilling her duties with the mechanical precision she had been trained to demonstrate, while inside, her heart was breaking. The night before the wedding, Mary wrote a long letter to Francis Apsley, pouring out her grief and fear. She spoke of feeling as though she were going to her execution rather than her wedding. She begged Francis not to forget her when she was far away in Holland. She expressed her terror at leaving England, leaving her sister, leaving everything familiar. The letter, which survives, is heartbreaking in its vulnerability and shows a side of Mary that she would soon learn to hide behind a mask of royal composure. The wedding itself took place at 9 o'clock in the evening in Mary's own bedchamber at St. James's Palace, a surprisingly intimate setting for such a momentous royal occasion. The room would have been crowded with witnesses, royalty, nobility, clergy, all pressed together to observe the ceremony. Mary wore white and silver, her dark hair dressed high, her face pale beneath the candlelight. She walked through the ceremony as if in a dream or a nightmare, speaking her vows in a voice so soft that some witnesses reported they could barely hear her. William, by contrast, appeared completely unmoved, his face showing no emotion beyond a cool satisfaction at having secured the alliance he wanted. When the bishop pronounced them man and wife, there was no tender kiss, no romantic gesture. The witnesses crowded around to congratulate them, led by King Charles, who made ribald jokes that caused Mary to blush scarlet with embarrassment. After the wedding ceremony came the bedding ritual, a humiliating public tradition where the bride and groom were escorted to the marriage bed by the assembled company. Mary was undressed by her ladies and put to bed while crude jokes and suggestive remarks flew about the chamber. William joined her, and they were ceremonially blessed before the curtains were drawn around the bed and the room finally cleared. History does not record what passed between them in the privacy of that curtained bed, but it seems unlikely that the experience was pleasant for a shy, frightened 15-year-old girl who had just been married to a virtual stranger. The newlyweds had barely 2 weeks together in England before William had to return to Holland to attend to urgent business. Mary was to remain behind until arrangements could be made for her journey to her new home. These 2 weeks were crucial in beginning to establish a relationship between them, and by all accounts, they were not easy. William was not naturally warm or demonstrative, and he made little effort to win Mary's affection. He was polite, respectful of her position, but emotionally distant. He spent most of his time in meetings and discussions, treating Mary more like a responsibility than a wife. Mary, for her part, tried to adapt and please her new husband, as she had been taught to do. She learned that William disliked the loose morals and frivolous behaviour of the English court, so she moderated her own conduct accordingly. She discovered that he was intensely devout, so she participated in religious observances with appropriate seriousness. She attempted to engage him in conversation, but found him unresponsive to small talk or social pleasantries. It was clear that theirs would not be a marriage of easy companionship, at least not immediately. Then, all too soon, William departed for Holland, and Mary was left behind to prepare for her own journey. The date of her departure was set for November 28th, giving her less than a month to say goodbye to England, to Anne, to everything she had ever known. These were anguished days for Mary. She spent as much time as possible with Anne, and the two sisters clung to each other, knowing that once Mary left, they might never see each other again. Foreign travel was dangerous, and the Netherlands seemed like the end of the world to these English girls who had never left their own country. Mary also bid farewell to her father, and this parting was complicated by the religious divide between them. James gave her his blessing, but also expressed his disappointment that she was marrying a Protestant and going to live among Protestants. He pressed upon her a Catholic confessor and some Catholic books, which Mary dutifully accepted, but which she would never use. The meeting was strained and sad, with love complicated by religious conviction on both sides. On the morning of November 28th, Mary boarded a yacht at Margate that would take her across the Channel to Holland. It was a stormy, bitter day, with high winds and rough seas. Anne had accompanied Mary to the coast, and their final parting on the dock was marked by uncontrollable weeping from both sisters. Witnesses reported that they had to be physically separated, both sobbing so hard they could barely stand. The crossing was nightmarish. The small vessel was tossed about on mountainous waves, and Mary was violently seasick for hours. She lay in her cabin, retching and miserable, convinced she was going to die, and in her darkest moments, perhaps half wishing she would. Death at least would spare her from this exile, from this marriage to a stranger, from this terrifying unknown future. But Mary did not die. After what must have seemed like an eternity, the yacht finally reached the Dutch coast, and Mary stumbled ashore at the fishing village of Ter. Green-faced and trembling but alive, William was there to meet her, and he helped her into a carriage that would take them to The Hague. As they drove through the flat Dutch countryside, so different from the rolling English hills, Mary looked out at bare fields and windmills, at canals and dikes, and felt herself entering an alien world. They arrived at the Binnenhof Palace in The Hague late that evening. The palace, a complex of buildings surrounding an inner courtyard, would be Mary's primary residence for the next 12 years. She was shown to her apartments, which had been prepared for her arrival, and left to rest from her ordeal. Alone in a strange bed, in a strange palace, in a strange country, Mary wept again for all she had lost. The early days and weeks of her new life were marked by profound homesickness and disorientation. Everything was different in Holland. The language sounded harsh and guttural to her English ears. The food was strange. The customs were unfamiliar. The weather was cold and damp, making the palace feel chilly and uncomfortable. Even the hours of daylight seemed different, the sun setting earlier and rising later than what she was accustomed to. Mary's relationship with William remained distant and formal. He was away much of the time, attending to his duties as stadtholder, and when he was present, he showed her courtesy but little warmth. He seemed to regard her more as a political ally and a useful connection to England than as a wife to be cherished. There were no love tokens, no tender words, no signs of growing affection. Making matters worse, Mary soon discovered that William was not entirely faithful to her. He had a long-time mistress, Elizabeth Villiers, who was actually one of Mary's own ladies-in-waiting, having come from England as part of Mary's household. Elizabeth was not beautiful. She had a squint and rather plain features, but she was intelligent and witty, and William enjoyed her company in ways he did not seem to enjoy Mary's. The affair was conducted with some discretion, but Mary knew of it, and it wounded her deeply. Yet despite all these difficulties, Mary did not give up or sink into permanent despair. She had been raised to do her duty, and she determined that she would be a good wife and a good Princess of Orange, regardless of whether her marriage brought her personal happiness. She began to study Dutch, working diligently until she could understand and speak the language fluently. She learned about Dutch history and customs. She attended public functions with William, presenting a gracious and dignified face to his people. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift in Mary's heart. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that William's coldness was not personal malice, but simply his nature. He had grown up without parents, raised by tutors and advisors, trained from childhood to be a leader rather than a loving family member. His life had been one of constant struggle and responsibility. He had learned to suppress emotion because emotion could be a weakness that his enemies might exploit. He was incapable of the romantic love that Mary had dreamed of, but he was not cruel, and in his own way, he did respect and value her. Mary also began to understand the enormous pressures William was under. He was trying to defend a small republic against the mightiest king in Europe. He bore the weight of his people's hopes and fears. He spent his days in exhausting military campaigns and his nights in strategic planning. His life was one of unrelenting work and worry. Seen in this light, his inability to be an attentive husband seemed more forgivable, more understandable. And so Mary made a conscious choice to love her husband, not because her feelings naturally inclined that way, but because her religion and her sense of duty required it. She began to focus on William's positive qualities, his courage, his intelligence, his dedication to the Protestant cause, his integrity. She determined to be supportive rather than demanding. patient rather than resentful. She wrote him affectionate letters when he was away, attended to his comfort when he was home, and showed him a loyalty that was at first dutiful, but would eventually become genuine. This transformation did not happen overnight. The first years of Mary's marriage were difficult, marked by continued homesickness, by loneliness, and by the bitter disappointment of her failure to conceive a child. But Mary was discovering within herself reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The shy, weeping girl who had arrived in Holland was beginning to grow into a woman of character and resilience, qualities she would need in abundance for the extraordinary role she was destined to play. The Netherlands that became Mary's home in 1677 was a remarkable place, quite unlike anywhere else in 17th century Europe. This small republic, carved out of marshy lowlands along the North Sea coast, had won its independence from Spain through decades of brutal warfare. Now, though still technically at war much of the time, it had become one of the most prosperous, sophisticated, and culturally vibrant regions in the world. For Mary, learning to understand and appreciate this strange new country would be a journey that would transform her from a homesick English girl into a beloved Dutch princess. The physical landscape alone must have seemed alien to Mary. Where England had rolling hills and forests, the Netherlands was relentlessly flat, so level that on a clear day you could see for miles across the polders. The reclaimed land that lay below sea level, protected by an intricate system of dikes and canals. Windmills dotted the horizon, their great sails turning in the constant wind, pumping water and grinding grain. The sky seemed enormous here, overwhelming in its vastness, with clouds racing across it pushed by winds that blew in from the sea. Water was everywhere in the Netherlands. Canals crisscrossed the cities, serving as highways for boats and barges. In winter, when the canals froze solid, people strapped on ice skates and glided along them, a method of transportation that seemed magical and slightly dangerous to Mary, who had never ice skated in her life. She would learn, of course, because she was determined to adapt to Dutch life, and eventually she too would skim across the frozen canals, her dark cloak billowing behind her, feeling for brief moments almost free. The Binnenhof Palace in The Hague, where Mary and William primarily resided, was a complex of medieval buildings surrounding a central courtyard called the Binnenhof, or Inner Court. It was less opulent than the English palaces Mary had known, reflecting the Dutch Republic's more sober and practical character. The rooms were heated by great ceramic stoves rather than open fireplaces, which made them warmer but also gave them a different atmosphere. The walls were often hung with tapestries or covered in leather, and the furniture, while elegant, was less gilded and ornate than what Mary was accustomed to. Mary's daily life in these early years followed a rhythm that was partly her own and partly dictated by William's comings and goings. When he was away on military campaigns, which was often, especially during the summer months, Mary was left to her own devices. She would rise early, as was the custom, and begin her day with private prayers in her chamber. Religion was central to Mary's life, providing comfort and structure, and she was scrupulous about her devotions, reading from the Bible and from books of Protestant theology. After prayers, she would dress with the help of her ladies-in-waiting. Mary brought with her from England a household of attendants, including several English ladies who had accompanied her to provide companionship and help her maintain her connection to her homeland. Among these was Elizabeth Villiers, who would later become the source of such pain for Mary, though in these early years, Elizabeth was simply one of the familiar faces from home. Breakfast in the Dutch fashion was simple: bread, cheese, butter, and beer or ale. The Dutch did not indulge in the heavy, elaborate meals that were common at the English court, and Mary learned to eat more simply, though she never quite developed a taste for some of the more unusual Dutch foods. After breakfast, she would attend to correspondence, writing letters to her sister Anne, to her father, to various relatives and friends in England. These letters were her lifeline to home, and she poured into them all the feelings and observations she could not express to those around her. The mornings were often devoted to learning. Mary continued her education in the Netherlands, studying Dutch language and literature with tutors. She also improved her French, which was the diplomatic language of Europe and essential for a princess who might need to entertain foreign visitors. She practiced music, spending hours at the harpsichord, finding in music a solace and expression that words could not provide. The sound of her playing would drift through the palace corridors, melancholy melodies that spoke of longing and loss. In good weather, Mary would walk in the palace gardens or ride in the countryside surrounding The Hague. The Dutch gardens were different from English ones, more geometrically precise, with formal parterres and carefully trimmed hedges reflecting the Dutch love of order and control. But they were beautiful in their own way, and Mary found peace in wandering among the flower beds and sitting beside the fountains. Sometimes she would take a carriage to visit one of the other palaces in William's possession, such as Het Loo, which would later become her favourite retreat. Afternoons might bring social obligations, receiving visitors, attending functions, presiding over gatherings of Dutch nobility. Mary worked hard to make a good impression on William's subjects, and her efforts were rewarded. The Dutch people, who had initially been curious but somewhat skeptical about this English princess, soon fell under her charm. Mary's natural warmth and grace, her genuine interest in learning about Dutch culture, and her obvious devotion to her husband won them over. Where William was admired but never quite loved, Mary became genuinely popular, and crowds would gather to see her whenever she appeared in public. The Dutch society that Mary entered was notably different from English court society. The Netherlands was a republic, not a monarchy, and while William held significant power as stadtholder, he was technically an elected official rather than a hereditary ruler. The real power lay with the States General, the representative body of the provinces, and with wealthy merchant families who dominated trade and commerce. This meant that the social hierarchy was less rigid than in England, and wealth and ability counted for more than noble birth alone. Mary found that she had to interact with merchants, bankers and traders, people who in England would have been considered beneath royal notice. At first, this was uncomfortable for her, as it seemed to violate the strict rules of precedence she had been taught. But gradually, she came to appreciate the vitality and intelligence of these self-made men and their families. The Dutch Republic was a place where new ideas flourished, where religious tolerance, at least among Protestants, was greater than elsewhere in Europe, where printing presses produced books and pamphlets that would have been censored in other countries. Art flourished in the Netherlands, and Mary became a patron of Dutch painters. This was the golden age of Dutch art, when masters like Rembrandt, Vermeer, and countless others were creating works of extraordinary beauty and skill. Mary commissioned portraits, collected paintings, and surrounded herself with beauty. She also became interested in porcelain, particularly the blue and white Chinese porcelain that was imported by Dutch trading ships, and she began to collect pieces that she displayed in her apartments. Yet, despite these distractions and occupations, Mary's life during these years was shadowed by a profound sorrow. Her inability to conceive a child. In the spring of 1678, a few months after her arrival in the Netherlands, Mary became pregnant. The joy this brought was immense, An heir to William's position would secure the succession and fulfill one of the primary purposes of royal marriage. But Mary's happiness was short-lived. During a visit to her husband at Breda, where he was overseeing military operations, Mary suffered a miscarriage. The loss was devastating, both physically and emotionally. This would not be the only miscarriage Mary would endure. Medical records suggest she suffered at least 3 more over the following years, in 1678, 1679, and 1680. Each loss took its toll on her health and her spirits. In an age when a woman's primary value was often measured by her ability to produce heirs, Mary's failure in this regard was a source of private anguish. She prayed fervently for a child, consulting physicians and following their often bizarre and painful advice, but nothing helped. Her womb remained empty, and as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that she would never bear children. This childlessness affected Mary's marriage in complex ways. On one hand, it may have intensified William's emotional distance, as he had less reason to cultivate intimacy with a wife who could not give him heirs. On the other hand, it meant that Mary's relationship with William was not complicated by the demands of motherhood, leaving her free to focus entirely on being his companion and partner. And as the years went by, as they navigated disappointments and challenges together, their relationship slowly evolved into something deeper than either might have anticipated. William, for all his coldness, was not an unkind husband. He appreciated Mary's loyalty and her efforts to support him. He valued her intelligence and increasingly sought her counsel on matters of state. He admired her piety and her commitment to Protestant principles. And gradually, as months turned into years, he began to rely on her in ways he relied on no one else. She became his confidant, his advisor, his steady presence in a world of constant turmoil. Mary, meanwhile, discovered that her initial forced decision to love her husband was becoming genuine. She saw in William's tireless work ethic a nobility of purpose. She admired his courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Year after year, he led armies against the French, often losing battles but never losing his determination. She came to understand his silences not as rejection, but as the natural reserve of a man who had learned early to guard his thoughts and feelings, and she found that serving him, supporting him, gave her life meaning and purpose. Their life together settled into patterns and rhythms. When William was home, they would dine together, sharing quiet meals where Mary would tell him news of the court, and he would explain the latest political and military developments. They would attend church services together, standing side by side in prayer. In the evenings, they would sometimes play cards, or William would work while Mary read or did needlework nearby, each pursuing their own activities, but drawing comfort from the other's presence. When William was away on campaign, which could be for months at a time, Mary would write him long letters. These letters, many of which survive, show the evolution of her feelings. The early letters are formal and dutiful, full of conventional phrases and appropriate sentiments. But as time passed, the letters became warmer, more personal, more revealing. "I love you more than my life," she wrote in one letter in 1690, "and desire only to please you." These were not empty words. They reflected the genuine devotion that had grown in Mary's heart, despite, or perhaps because of, all the difficulties. William's letters to Mary were shorter and less emotionally revealing, as might be expected from his character, but they showed his own growing attachment. He would share military news with her, ask her advice on political matters, express concern for her health and happiness. He began to wear a lock of her hair in a locket next to his heart, a gesture that, coming from William, was remarkably sentimental. The Dutch years were not all solemnity and sorrow. Mary had moments of genuine happiness. She enjoyed the company of her ladies-in-waiting, engaging in the gossip and chatter that women have always enjoyed. She took pleasure in decorating her apartments, choosing fabrics and furniture, arranging flowers. She loved music and organized concerts where Dutch and English musicians would perform. She enjoyed watching plays and masques. Though William rarely joined her in this entertainment, she also developed a close relationship with William's grandmother, Amalia van Solms, the Dowager Princess of Orange. Amalia was an intelligent, cultured woman who had survived many political storms, and she became something of a surrogate grandmother to Mary, offering advice and affection. When Amalia died in 1675, before Mary's arrival, Mary had missed knowing her, but she heard many stories about this remarkable woman and drew inspiration from her example. The seasons marked the passage of Mary's years in Holland. Spring brought tulips, masses of them in every colour, transforming the Dutch gardens into seas of brilliant bloom. The Dutch were mad for tulips, and Mary caught their enthusiasm, collecting rare varieties and planning elaborate displays. Summer brought military campaigns and William's absence, but also long days of golden light, when Mary could ride and walk and feel the sun on her face. Autumn brought William's return, harvest festivals, and the preparation for winter. And winter brought ice and snow, frozen canals, and long evenings by the stove, reading and thinking and writing letters home. Through all these seasons, Mary maintained her connection to England through correspondence with her sister Anne. The sisters wrote to each other regularly, sharing news and feelings, maintaining the close bond they had formed in childhood. Anne's letters brought Mary word of events at the English court, of their father's activities, of political developments. Mary's letters told Anne of life in Holland, of William's campaigns, of her own growing attachment to this strange flat land that had become her home. Mary also corresponded with her father, though these letters were more difficult. The religious divide between them created tension in every exchange. James wanted his daughter to be sympathetic to Catholicism. Mary remained firmly Protestant. James wanted her to use her influence with William on behalf of Catholic interests. Mary would not and could not do so. Yet despite these strains, there remained love between father and daughter, a love that would be tested to the breaking point in the years to come. By the mid-1680s, Mary had been in the Netherlands for nearly a decade. She was no longer the frightened, homesick girl who had arrived weeping on the Dutch shore. She had matured into a woman of substance and character. She spoke Dutch fluently, understood Dutch culture, and was beloved by the Dutch people. She had learned to manage a royal household, to navigate complex social situations, to represent her husband's interests with grace and skill. She had survived personal disappointments and grown stronger from them. She had also, slowly and against all initial expectations, fallen deeply in love with her husband. William would never be demonstrative or romantic in the conventional sense, but Mary had learned to read his silences, to recognize the small gestures that from him were equivalent to passionate declarations from other men. She had learned to be content with a love that expressed itself in trust and partnership, rather than in poetry and protestations. Mary had found a kind of peace in the Netherlands, a life that, while not what she had imagined as a girl, had its own satisfactions and joys. She had her faith, her music, her gardens, her friendships. She had William, and increasingly, she had his heart as he had hers. She had created a home for herself in this foreign land, and she could have been happy continuing in this quiet, useful life indefinitely. But history had other plans for Mary. Events were stirring in England that would shatter her peaceful Dutch existence and thrust her into a role of power and responsibility she had never sought. The storm that had been gathering on the political horizon was about to break, and Mary would find herself at the very center of it. forced to choose between her father and her faith, between family loyalty and duty to her adopted nation and her husband. The quiet years in Holland were coming to an end, and nothing in Mary's life would ever be simple or peaceful again. The year 1685 marked a turning point, not just in Mary's life, but in the history of England. On the 6th of February, King Charles II died after suffering a sudden stroke, and Mary's father ascended the throne as King James II of England and 7th of Scotland. At the age of 51, after decades of waiting, James finally wore the crown he had so long anticipated. For Mary, the news brought mixed feelings: joy that her father had achieved his life's ambition, but deep anxiety about what his reign might bring. The anxiety was well-founded. James made no secret of his Catholic faith, and while he initially promised to uphold the Church of England and respect the religious settlement of the nation, it quickly became clear that he intended to use his royal power to advance Catholic interests. Within months of his accession, James began appointing Catholics to important positions in government, the military, and the universities, flouting the Test Acts that barred Catholics from public office. Mary followed these developments from the Netherlands with growing alarm. William, too, watched the situation in England with keen interest. He knew that English support was crucial for his ongoing struggle against Louis XIV of France, and he could not afford to have England allied with Catholic France instead of Protestant Netherlands. Moreover, as Mary's husband, William had a legitimate interest in the English succession. If James had no male heir, and it seemed increasingly likely that he would not, as his second wife Mary of Modena had suffered multiple miscarriages, then Mary stood next in line for the throne, and William would be king consort. The first 2 years of James's reign saw a steady deterioration in relations between the king and his Protestant subjects. James issued a declaration of indulgence that suspended the penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters, claiming this was an act of religious tolerance. But many saw it as the first step toward re-establishing Catholicism as England's state religion. When James ordered that the declaration be read from every pulpit in England, 7 bishops, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, refused and petitioned the king to withdraw the order. James had them arrested and tried for seditious libel, a move that backfired spectacularly when a jury acquitted them to general rejoicing. Throughout this period, Mary found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She loved her father and wanted to be a dutiful daughter, but she could not support his religious policies. James wrote to her regularly, sometimes trying to convince her of the rightness of Catholicism, other times simply seeking her affection and approval. Mary wrote back affectionate letters, but she could not give him what he wanted: her endorsement of his actions. The correspondence between Mary and her sister Anne during these years shows their shared anxiety. Anne, who had remained in England and married Prince George of Denmark, was closer to the situation and could report firsthand on the growing crisis. The sisters wrote to each other in code at times, using false names and careful language in case their letters were intercepted. They shared their fears, their prayers, and their determination to remain true to their Protestant faith, whatever the cost. Then, in the summer of 1688, everything changed. On the 10th of June, Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward. The birth of a male Catholic heir to the throne sent shockwaves through Protestant England. As long as James had only Protestant daughters, people could tolerate his Catholic reign, knowing it would not outlast him. But now there was the prospect of a Catholic dynasty, of generations of Catholic kings ruling over Protestant England. It was, for many, an intolerable prospect. Almost immediately, rumours began circulating that the birth was a fraud. The pregnancy had been kept relatively quiet, and the birth had happened with unusual rapidity. Scandalous stories spread that the baby was not the Queen's child at all, but had been smuggled into her bedchamber in a warming pan, a metal container filled with hot coals used to warm beds, and substituted for a stillborn infant. The stories were absurd and cruel, but they gained wide credence because people wanted to believe them, wanted any reason to reject this inconvenient Catholic heir. Mary heard these rumours in the Netherlands, and she wanted to believe them too. Her sister Anne wrote to her from England with detailed questions about the circumstances of the birth, hinting strongly at her own doubts about the baby's legitimacy. Mary seized on these doubts and convinced herself that there had indeed been frickery, that the child was a pretender, that her father had participated in a massive deception to secure a Catholic succession. Modern historians are virtually certain that the warming pan story was complete fabrication, that James Francis Edward was indeed the legitimate son of James II and Mary of Modena. But in 1688, Mary believed, or convinced herself to believe, the rumours. This belief was psychologically necessary for her, because it allowed her to justify what was about to happen. In late June, just weeks after the birth of the supposed prince, a group of 7 prominent English politicians and nobles sent a secret invitation to William of Orange. The letter, signed by men who became known to history as the Immortal Seven, begged William to bring an army to England to protect Protestant liberties and to investigate the truth about the prince's birth. They assured him that he would have widespread support, that James's army would not fight for him, that the people yearned for deliverance from Catholic tyranny. William received this invitation with careful consideration. He was a cautious man, not given to rash action, and he understood the enormous risks involved. Invading England would require assembling a large fleet and army, which would be expensive and would leave the Netherlands vulnerable to French attack. Moreover, if the invasion failed, he would be branded a traitor and a rebel, and Mary's position as heir to the English throne would be destroyed. But William also saw the opportunity. If he could secure England for Protestantism and bring England into his coalition against France, the strategic benefits would be immense, and there was the matter of the succession. If he and Mary were to rule England, they must act now, before James's supposed son grew old enough to establish himself as the legitimate heir. William discussed the matter with Mary, and this was perhaps one of the most difficult conversations of their marriage. He was asking her, in effect, to support an invasion of her native country and the overthrow of her own father. It was a monstrous thing to ask, and Mary understood the full weight of it. She spent long hours in prayer, seeking divine guidance, wrestling with her conscience. In the end, Mary gave William her support and blessing. She convinced herself, perhaps had to convince herself, that she was not betraying her father, but saving him from evil counselors. She believed that once William arrived in England with an army, James would see reason, would send away his Catholic advisers, would return to the Protestant fold. She told herself that what they were doing was necessary to save England from popery and tyranny, that God would justify their actions, that her duty to her religion and her nation must override her duty to her father. It is difficult, looking back across the centuries, to judge Mary's decision. From a modern perspective, her willingness to support the overthrow of her father seems cruel and unnatural. But we must remember the context, the deep religious hatreds of the age, the genuine fear that Protestants had of Catholic persecution, the memory of Queen Mary I's burnings, the stories of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. For Mary, raised in fervent Protestantism, taught that Catholicism was not just wrong, but actively evil. The choice between father and faith was agonizing, but ultimately clear. William spent the summer and autumn of 1688 preparing his expedition. He assembled a fleet of nearly 500 ships, the largest invasion force England had seen since the Spanish Armada a century before. He gathered an army of 14,000 men, including Dutch, German, and English troops. He had coins struck showing himself in armour with the inscription, "For the Protestant religion and liberty." He issued a declaration explaining his actions, claiming he came not to conquer, but to secure a free parliament that could investigate the legitimacy of the prince's birth and redress English grievances. As these preparations went forward, Mary remained at The Hague, waiting anxiously for news. She knew that William's fleet might be destroyed by storms or by the English navy. She knew that even if he landed safely, he might face James's army in battle, and that William could be killed. The man she loved was about to risk everything, and he was doing it partly because she had given him permission to do so. The fleet finally sailed on November 1st, 1688, but was driven back by Protestant winds that the English called Protestant winds because they prevented the Dutch from landing. The fleet sailed again on November 11th, and this time the winds favoured them. William's armada sailed past the English navy in the Channel, which was caught out of position, and landed at Torbay in Devon on November 5th. News of William's landing reached Mary at The Hague, and she could only wait and pray. Reports came slowly. William had landed unopposed, was marching toward London, was gathering English supporters to his standard. James had assembled an army to oppose him, but the army was melting away as officers and soldiers deserted to William. Princess Anne had fled from London to join William's forces, publicly repudiating her father. Then came the news that shook Mary to her core. James had fled, faced with universal desertion, including the defection of his closest friends and even his younger daughter. James had lost his nerve. He had attempted to escape to France, had been caught by fishermen, and had then been allowed to escape again with William's tacit permission. By December, James was in France under the protection of Louis XIV, and England was effectively without a king. A convention parliament was called to decide what to do. Some wanted to make Mary queen in her own right, since she was clearly the rightful heir. Others wanted William to rule as regent for James, who they argued had not truly abdicated. William himself made it clear that he would not accept any arrangement that made him merely his wife's consort. He would be king in his own right, or he would return to the Netherlands. Mary followed all of this from Holland, and she was torn by conflicting emotions. There was relief that William had succeeded without major bloodshed. The Glorious Revolution, as it would later be called, was remarkably bloodless in England itself, though it would be far from bloodless in Ireland and Scotland. There was anxiety about what would happen next, and there was profound guilt and grief about her father's fate. On February 13, 1689, Parliament offered the crown jointly to William and Mary. They would reign together as William III and Mary II, with equal status and authority. This was an unprecedented arrangement in English history, but it solved the political problem. William got the power he demanded, and Mary's claim through heredity was acknowledged. Mary received the news at The Hague, and now she had to prepare to leave the Netherlands, the country that had been her home for 12 years, and return to the England she had left as a bride of 15. She was now 26 years old, no longer a girl, but a mature woman who had been tested by life and found strong. She was about to become Queen of England, a role she had never sought and did not particularly want, but which duty now demanded she accept. Before she left Holland, Mary spent time saying goodbye to the places and people she had come to love. She walked through the gardens one last time, visited the places where she had found peace and solace. She thanked her household staff and made generous provisions for those who had served her faithfully. She gathered the personal possessions she wanted to bring to England. her books, her musical instruments, her collection of porcelain, her correspondence with Anne, and she prayed. She prayed for guidance, for strength, for forgiveness. She prayed that she had made the right choice, that God would bless the path she and William were taking. She prayed for her father, exiled and alone in France. She prayed for England, that it might be healed of its divisions and find peace. In mid-February, Mary boarded a ship for England. The crossing this time was calmer than her first journey across the Channel 12 years before, but her emotions were no less turbulent. She was returning home, but under what circumstances? She was to be queen, but at what cost? She was about to see her sister again, but would Anne forgive her for supporting the overthrow of their father? As the English coast came into view, Mary stood on deck, wrapped in her cloak against the cold wind, and wondered what the future would hold. She had been transformed by her years in Holland from a frightened girl into a woman of principle and courage. Now she was about to face the greatest challenge of her life, ruling a nation torn by religious and political strife, doing it jointly with a husband whose coldness she had learned to bear, and doing it all while carrying the burden of knowing she had betrayed her father to secure her throne. The ship sailed up the Thames toward London, and Mary could see the city rising before her, the great dome of St. Paul's Cathedral being rebuilt after the Great Fire, the Tower of London where so many of her ancestors had lived and died, the palaces where she would now reign. She was coming home, but nothing would ever be the same again. The storm that had been gathering for so long had finally broken, and Mary was at the center of it. Now she would have to prove herself worthy of the crown she had never wanted, but could no longer refuse. The journey up the Thames to London gave Mary time to compose herself and to prepare mentally for what lay ahead. William had already been in England for several months, and he had sent messages urging her to come with all speed. But Mary had deliberately delayed, perhaps hoping that some other solution might present itself, perhaps simply needing time to steel herself for what she knew would be an ordeal. Now, as the ship approached the city, she could delay no longer. London, in February of 1689, was a city transformed by political upheaval. The streets buzzed with rumours and speculation. Pamphlets and broadsides circulated everywhere, some praising William and Mary as Protestant deliverers, others condemning them as usurpers who had betrayed a lawful king. Coffee houses were packed with men arguing about politics and religion. The mood was volatile, a mixture of celebration and uncertainty, with the potential for violence simmering just beneath the surface. William came aboard the ship to greet Mary before it docked, and their reunion was both public and private. In front of the assembled courtiers and officials, they embraced with formal dignity, playing their roles as joint sovereigns-to-be. But in the brief moments when they were alone, Mary clung to her husband, seeking reassurance and comfort. "I'm glad you are here," William told her simply. And for him, this was an expression of deep feeling. What happened next has been controversial for centuries. When Mary stepped off the ship and entered Whitehall Palace, she allegedly appeared cheerful, even jubilant, laughing and examining the rooms with apparent delight. This behavior shocked many observers, who thought she should show more sorrow for her father's exile. Sarah Churchill, who would later become Duchess of Marlborough and Mary's chief critic, wrote scathingly that Mary seemed to be going to a wedding rather than entering on a usurpation. But this interpretation may be unfair. William had specifically instructed Mary to appear cheerful, to show confidence and legitimacy. He understood that any sign of doubt or guilt from Mary would undermine their claim to the throne. Mary was following his orders, putting on a brave face in public, while privately her heart was breaking. She wrote later that she had experienced secret joy at returning to her homeland, but this was soon checked with the consideration of my father's misfortunes. The truth is that Mary's emotions during this period were impossibly complex. She was genuinely glad to be back in England, to be reunited with her sister, to see familiar places and faces. She believed sincerely that what she and William were doing was necessary and right, but she also felt profound guilt and grief about her father's situation. These conflicting feelings could not be reconciled, so she compartmentalized them, showing the world the face that was required while suffering privately. Her reunion with Anne was initially joyful. The sisters had not seen each other in 12 years, and both wept as they embraced. But even this reunion was complicated by politics. Anne had actively supported William's invasion and had publicly repudiated their father, actions that had been politically necessary but personally agonizing. The sisters found that while their affection for each other remained, they were also strangers in some ways, each changed by the years and experiences that had separated them. The question of the succession had to be resolved quickly. Parliament had been meeting as a convention, technically illegal, since Parliament could only be summoned by a monarch, and there was no monarch, to determine what should be done. The situation was unprecedented. James II had fled but had not abdicated. His infant son was presumably the rightful heir, but few wanted a Catholic baby king. Mary was next in line after the prince, but she was a woman, and England had only had one previous ruling queen, Mary I, whose reign was remembered with horror. Some members of Parliament argued that Mary should rule alone as Queen Regnant, with William simply as her consort. This would respect the hereditary principle and avoid the problem of having a foreign king. But William flatly refused to accept such an arrangement. He had conquered England, for it was a conquest, however bloodless, and he would not be reduced to playing second fiddle to his wife. "I will not be my wife's gentleman usher," reportedly said. If Parliament did not make him king in his own right, he would return to Holland and leave England to sort out its own problems. Mary herself resolved the impasse. In a decision that shows both her sense of duty and her understanding of political reality, she made it clear that she supported William's position. She told Parliament that she had no desire to rule alone, that she believed a husband should be his wife's head in all things, and that William should be king with full sovereign powers. This statement was partly genuine conviction. Mary truly believed in wifely obedience, and partly political calculation. She understood that William was essential to England's security, that his military expertise and European connections were invaluable, and that Parliament would never accept him as a mere consort. On February 13th, 1689, Parliament passed the Declaration of Right, which laid out the grievances against James II and offered the crown jointly to William and Mary. The declaration stated that James had attempted to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of the kingdom, and that by fleeing to France he had abdicated the government, leaving the throne vacant. William and Mary would reign as joint sovereigns with equal status, though William would exercise the actual powers of government. The coronation was set for April 11th, 1689, and it would be a ceremony unlike any England had seen before. Two monarchs would be crowned simultaneously, each taking the full coronation oath, each anointed with holy oil, each receiving crown and scepter. A special chair had to be commissioned for Mary, as there was only one ancient coronation throne. The ceremony would make plain that this was a joint monarchy, that Mary was not a mere queen consort but a ruling queen in her own right. In the weeks before the coronation, Mary had to adjust to her new role and to life back in England. She found that her position was more complicated than she had anticipated. As joint sovereign, she theoretically had equal power with William, but in practice, William made all the important decisions. Mary was consulted on matters of state, and her opinions were valued. But when William was present, he was clearly the dominant partner in the relationship. Mary also had to navigate the complex relationships at the English court. Many of the nobles and officials who now surrounded her had been loyal to her father, until it became politically expedient to abandon him. She knew that many of them had supported William's invasion purely for their own advantage, and that they might just as easily turn against her if circumstances changed. Trust was a rare commodity in the new court. The relationship with Anne quickly became strained. Anne wanted money, specifically a substantial parliamentary allowance that would make her financially independent. William was reluctant to grant this, fearing that an independent Anne could become a focus for opposition. Mary found herself caught in the middle, wanting to help her sister, but also needing to support her husband. When she ultimately sided with William and refused to advocate for Anne's full financial demands, Anne was hurt and angry. The sisters' relationship, so close in childhood, began to cool. The coronation ceremony on April 11th was magnificent, a display of royal splendor designed to legitimize the new regime and awe the populace. Mary wore robes of cloth of gold, heavy with jewels, and a crown specially made for the occasion. She walked in procession to Westminster Abbey, through streets lined with cheering crowds, while bells rang and cannons fired salutes. Inside the abbey, she and William went through the ancient ritual together, each crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, each acclaimed by the assembled peers and clergy. As the crown was placed on her head and the holy oil blessed her forehead, Mary felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was now, by the grace of God and the will of Parliament, Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was a role she had never sought, achieved through means that troubled her conscience, but it was hers now, and she was determined to fulfill it to the best of her ability. The early months of the reign were consumed with establishing legitimacy and dealing with threats to the new government. In Scotland, supporters of James II, called Jacobites after the Latin form of James's name, raised rebellion. In Ireland, where James still had strong support among the Catholic population, a full-scale war erupted. James himself, backed by French troops and money, landed in Ireland in March 1689, hoping to use it as a base to reconquer his kingdoms. William spent much of 1690 in Ireland, personally leading the campaign against his father-in-law. The decisive battle came at the River Boyne on July 1st, where William's forces defeated James's army in a hard-fought engagement. James fled back to France. His hopes of restoration effectively ended. William pursued the campaign through 1691, finally securing English control over Ireland at tremendous cost in Irish lives and suffering. For Mary, William's absence in Ireland was a crucial test. With her husband away on campaign, she had to rule England alone. She had a council of advisers, but the final decisions were hers to make. She had to manage Parliament, deal with diplomatic crises, maintain order in a still unsettled kingdom. And she discovered something surprising. She was good at it. Mary brought to government the same conscientious diligence she brought to everything else. She attended council meetings religiously, listened carefully to advice, and made decisions with thoughtful deliberation. She was not a brilliant political mind like Elizabeth I had been, but she was sensible, pious, and committed to doing what was right. She worked hard to understand the issues facing the nation, reading reports and documents late into the night, consulting with ministers and experts. She also brought a moral dimension to government that had been lacking under previous monarchs. Mary was deeply concerned with the spiritual and moral health of the nation. She issued proclamations against vice and immorality, ordered the enforcement of laws against drunkenness and profanity, supported the work of religious societies dedicated to moral reformation. Some found her moral crusades oppressive, but many others welcomed them, seeing in Mary a queen who took seriously her role as defender of Protestant faith and morals. During William's absence, Mary also had to deal with the discovery of plots against the new government. Several conspiracies were uncovered, involving plans to assassinate William and restore James. Mary had to authorize arrests and trials, including the arrest of her own uncle, the Earl of Clarendon. These were agonizing decisions, but Mary steeled herself to make them, convinced that the security of the Protestant succession was paramount. One of the most painful episodes involved John Churchill, who had been a close friend and supporter of the family, but was suspected of corresponding with James in France. Churchill's wife Sarah was Anne's dearest friend and closest confidant, which made the situation even more delicate. When Mary ordered Churchill's dismissal from his offices, Anne was furious and saw it as a betrayal. The incident widened the breach between the sisters, and Mary found herself isolated, with even her own sister turning against her. Yet despite these difficulties, Mary persevered. She ruled with increasing confidence and skill, earning the respect of those who worked with her. When William returned from Ireland in September 1690, he found that Mary had managed the kingdom effectively in his absence. He began to trust her more, to rely on her judgment, and to leave more decisions in her hands. The Glorious Revolution was not, despite its name, entirely glorious or bloodless. In Ireland, it had meant war, famine, and the subjugation of the Catholic population under harsh penal laws. In Scotland, it had meant rebellion and brutal suppression, including the infamous massacre of Glencoe in 1692, where William ordered punitive action against a clan that had been slow to swear allegiance, resulting in the murder of innocent men, women, and children. When news of the massacre became public, it damaged William's reputation, though Mary's was largely untouched. For Mary personally, the revolution meant living with the constant knowledge that she had helped overthrow her father. James lived on in exile at the French court, a sad and bitter figure who wrote occasional letters to his daughters, reproaching them for their betrayal. Mary could not bring herself to respond to these letters, which cut her deeply. She tried to find solace in prayer, convincing herself that she had acted righteously, that God would vindicate her choice. But the guilt never entirely left her. The revolution also meant living under constant threat. Jacobite agents plotted assassinations, French spies worked to undermine the government, and there was always the possibility that James might return with a French army to reclaim his throne. Mary and William had to maintain vigilance, to trust no one completely, to be always on guard. But the revolution had achieved its primary purpose. It had secured Protestant succession and established the principle of parliamentary supremacy. The Bill of Rights, passed in December 1689, laid out fundamental liberties and limited royal power in ways that would shape British government for centuries. No longer could a monarch suspend laws, levy taxes without Parliament's consent, or maintain a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary approval. The balance of power had shifted permanently from Crown to Parliament. Mary's role in this transformation was more than symbolic. By accepting the Crown and ruling effectively, she demonstrated that a woman could be a legitimate and capable monarch. By submitting to William's authority in public, while exercising real power when he was absent, she showed that the partnership model of monarchy could work, and by remaining steadfast in her Protestant faith and her commitment to parliamentary government, she helped ensure that the revolution's gains would be permanent. As the early 1690s unfolded, Mary settled into her role as queen. She had survived the transition from princess to sovereign, had navigated the dangers of revolution, and had proven herself capable of rule. But ruling a kingdom at war, maintaining a troubled relationship with her sister, and living with the guilt of her father's exile took their toll on Mary's health and spirits. The years ahead would bring both personal growth and personal tragedy, as Mary discovered within herself reserves of strength she had never known she possessed, even as she lost much that she held dear. The period following the coronation brought Mary face to face with the reality of queenship, and it was far different from anything she had imagined during her years as Princess of Orange. The theoretical power of a monarch and the practical exercise of that power were two entirely different things, and Mary had to learn quickly how to navigate the complex waters of English politics, court intrigue, and public opinion. One of Mary's first priorities was establishing her household and court. Unlike William, who was content with a small circle of Dutch advisers and had little patience for the elaborate rituals of royal ceremony, Mary understood the importance of court life in English culture. The court was not just where the monarch lived. It was the centre of political power, social prestige, and cultural life. Mary set about creating a court that would reflect both royal dignity and moral propriety. She assembled around her a group of ladies-in-waiting and household officers, choosing people who combined noble birth with impeccable Protestant credentials. She was careful to balance political factions, appointing women from both Whig and Tory families to avoid showing favoritism. She also insisted on high moral standards from everyone in her household, making it clear that the loose behavior tolerated in previous reigns would not be acceptable in hers. The Queen's Day followed a strict schedule that Mary established and adhered to with characteristic discipline. She rose early, usually around 6 or 7 in the morning, and began with private devotions in her chamber. Mary's piety was genuine and deep, and she spent at least an hour each morning in prayer and Bible reading. She kept a spiritual journal where she recorded her prayers, her struggles with sin, and her efforts to live a godly life. After prayers came the dressing ceremony, where Mary's ladies-in-waiting helped her into the elaborate gowns and undergarments required by her position. This was not merely a practical necessity, but a public ritual, with the privilege of handing the Queen her gloves or placing her jewels carefully distributed among the ladies according to rank and favour. Mary endured this daily ceremony with patience, understanding that these rituals mattered to those who participated in them. Breakfast was taken semi-publicly, with select members of the court in attendance. Mary ate simply by royal standards: bread, cold meats, perhaps some fruit. But the meal was an opportunity for her to receive petitions, hear news, and conduct informal business. After breakfast came audiences with ministers and officials, where the real work of government took place. Mary took these governmental duties seriously. She studied the papers prepared for her, asked probing questions, and made decisions with care. She had a particular interest in ecclesiastical matters, the government of the Church of England, and took an active role in appointing bishops and distributing church patronage. She saw herself as a Protestant queen with a responsibility to uphold and defend true religion, and she used her influence to promote clergy who she believed were both pious and learned. The afternoons were often devoted to public appearances or cultural activities. Mary would receive foreign ambassadors, attend ceremonies, or preside over functions at court. She was also a generous patron of the arts, commissioning works from painters, architects, and musicians. She had a particular love for music and would often have concerts arranged in the palace, with the finest performers brought into play for her and her guests. One of Mary's most significant cultural contributions was her support for architecture and design. She and William undertook major renovations of Kensington Palace, which they preferred to the damp and smoky Whitehall Palace in central London. Mary worked closely with the architect Christopher Wren to create apartments that were both elegant and comfortable. She had a special passion for collecting and displaying porcelain, particularly the blue and white Chinese pieces that were fashionable at the time, and she designed special chambers with shelves and niches for displaying her collection. The gardens were another focus of Mary's attention. She created elaborate gardens at both Kensington and Hampton Court, working with designers to create formal parterres, fountains, and exotic plantings. She introduced the fashion for orange trees in tubs, which could be brought inside during winter, and she created a greenhouse at Kensington for tropical plants. Walking in her gardens was one of Mary's few true pleasures during her years as queen, a respite from the pressures and conflicts of court life. But these pleasant activities were always overshadowed by the difficult realities of ruling a divided nation still recovering from revolution. Mary had to contend with several serious challenges during her first years as queen, each of which tested her ability and resolve. The first challenge was religious. As queen, Mary was supreme governor of the Church of England, and she took this role very seriously. She was determined to promote genuine piety and to combat what she saw as the moral decline of the nation. She issued proclamations against vice, established religious societies to promote moral behavior, and used her patronage to reward clergymen who preached and lived according to strict standards. Not everyone appreciated Mary's moral crusades. Many at court found her strictness oppressive and complained that she was turning the palace into a convent. But Mary was unmoved by such criticisms. She believed that as queen, she had a responsibility before God to set a good example and to promote righteousness in the nation. She could not control what people did in private, but she could at least ensure that vice was not openly flaunted at court. The second challenge was political, managing the relationship between Crown and Parliament. The Bill of Rights had fundamentally altered the balance of power, making Parliament more powerful than ever before. Mary and William needed parliamentary approval for taxes to fund the ongoing war against France, which meant they had to work with Parliament rather than simply commanding it. This was difficult for William, who had autocratic tendencies and little patience for parliamentary debate. But Mary understood better than her husband the importance of maintaining good relations with Parliament. When William was away on campaign, Mary made special efforts to attend sessions of Parliament, to meet with parliamentary leaders, and to show respect for the institution even when its members were being difficult. The third challenge was personal, the deteriorating relationship with her sister Anne. The conflict over Anne's financial allowance had been only the beginning of their troubles. The real break came over Anne's friendship with Sarah Churchill, now Countess of Marlborough. Sarah Churchill was one of the most fascinating and controversial figures at court. She was beautiful, witty, and fiercely ambitious, and she had complete domination over Anne's affections. Anne was utterly devoted to Sarah, relying on her for emotional support and allowing Sarah to influence her decisions. The two women had pet names for each other. Anne was Mrs. Morley and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman, and wrote to each other constantly in terms of passionate friendship that sound almost romantic to modern ears. Mary was troubled by Sarah's influence over Anne. She believed that Sarah was manipulating Anne for her own advantage and that of her husband, John Churchill, the Earl of Marlborough. When evidence emerged that Marlborough might be corresponding with James II in France, possibly plotting to restore him, Mary ordered Marlborough dismissed from all his offices and barred from court. Anne was outraged. She saw Mary's action as an attack on her dearest friend and refused to dismiss Sarah from her own household as Mary demanded. The quarrel escalated, with Anne appearing at court accompanied by Sarah in deliberate defiance of Mary's wishes. Finally, in January 1692, Mary lost her temper and confronted Anne directly, demanding that Anne either dismiss Sarah or leave the palace. Anne chose to leave, moving out of the palace and establishing her own household. The breach between the sisters was now complete. They continued to live in the same city, but did not speak to each other, did not visit, communicated only through formal written messages when absolutely necessary. Mary found this estrangement painful beyond words. She had already lost her father through political necessity. Now she had lost her sister through personal conflict. She wrote in her journal of her sorrow, her sense of isolation, her feeling that she was surrounded by people but truly close to no one. Adding to Mary's emotional burdens was her continued childlessness. She was now in her late 20s, and with each passing year, the hope of bearing an heir grew dimmer. The lack of children was not just a personal sorrow, but a political problem. If Mary and William died without heirs, the succession would pass to Anne. But Anne's many pregnancies had resulted in a string of heartbreaking losses, stillbirths, miscarriages, and children who died in infancy. The Stuart line seemed cursed with reproductive tragedy, and there was real concern about what would happen if both Mary and Anne died without surviving children. Mary tried not to dwell on her childlessness, focusing instead on her duties and her spiritual life. She told herself that God had called her to serve as queen rather than as a mother, and that she must accept his will. But the pain was always there, particularly when she heard news of Anne's latest pregnancy and subsequent loss. Despite their estrangement, Mary felt compassion for her sister's suffering, even as she resented the fact that Anne had chosen Sarah Churchill over their sisterly bond. In April 1692, Mary herself fell seriously ill with a fever. For several days, she was gravely sick, and there was real fear that she might die. William, who was preparing to leave for his military campaign, delayed his departure to remain at her bedside. As Mary lay ill, she made preparations for death, settling her spiritual accounts and reviewing her will. She recovered, but the illness left her weakened and reminded everyone of how fragile the succession was. Despite these personal trials, Mary continued to fulfill her duties as queen with diligence and grace. She attended to the business of government, read the papers presented to her, made decisions on appointments and policy. When William was absent on campaign, which was most summers from May through September, Mary ruled alone, presiding over council meetings and making decisions on everything from military strategy to ecclesiastical appointments. Mary proved to be a capable administrator. She had a good grasp of detail and a methodical approach to problems. She was not brilliant or innovative, but she was conscientious and thorough. She listened to advice, but was willing to make unpopular decisions when she thought them necessary. Ministers who had initially been skeptical of having a woman as ruler came to respect Mary's judgment and her dedication to duty. One area where Mary exercised particular influence was in matters of morality and religion. She used her position to promote clergy who she believed were both learned and pious. She was especially concerned about the moral state of the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, which she saw as breeding grounds for both vice and Catholic sympathies. She worked to ensure that college heads and professors were sound Protestants who would train the next generation in proper doctrine and godly living. Mary also concerned herself with charity and the relief of poverty. She made generous donations to hospitals, schools, and almshouses. She established a fund to provide dowries for poor girls. She supported the work of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which distributed Bibles and religious literature. Her charity was genuine and heartfelt, flowing from her deep Christian faith and her belief that those in power had a responsibility to care for those in need. As Queen, Mary had to balance multiple roles and expectations. She had to be William's wife, supporting his policies and representing his interests. She had to be a queen in her own right, exercising authority and commanding respect. She had to be supreme governor of the Church of England, upholding Protestant doctrine and promoting piety. She had to be a public figure, maintaining the dignity and ceremony of monarchy. And through it all, she had to be herself, a woman of faith and principle trying to do what was right in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Mary managed this balancing act with remarkable success. She never challenged William's authority publicly, maintaining the appearance of wifely submission that her age expected. But in private, and when William was absent, she exercised real power and showed genuine leadership ability. She found a way to be both a ruling queen and a dutiful wife, navigating the contradiction through a combination of political skill and genuine religious conviction. By the end of 1692, Mary had been queen for 3 years. She had survived political crises, personal losses, and serious illness. She had proven herself capable of ruling and had earned the respect of most of her subjects. But she was also tired, sad, and sometimes lonely. The weight of the crown was heavy. The burden of guilt over her father never fully lifted. The pain of estrangement from Anne always present. Mary found her comfort where she always had, in prayer, in duty, and in her love for William, who had become in truth what he had been originally in name only, the husband of her heart as well as her throne. The joint monarchy of William and Mary was an unprecedented experiment in English governance, and making it work required both political skill and personal sacrifice, particularly from Mary. In theory, they ruled as equals. Both took the coronation oath, both signed state documents, both were addressed as Your Majesty. But in practice, the reality was more complex and more interesting than the formal arrangement suggested. When William was in England, which was roughly half the year, he was clearly the dominant partner in the relationship. He attended council meetings, made the major decisions on policy, conducted diplomatic negotiations, and commanded the military. Mary's role during these periods was more ceremonial and supportive. She received foreign visitors, presided over court functions, and represented the crown at public occasions. She also served as William's closest advisor and confidant, the one person with whom he could speak freely and honestly. But when William left England for his annual military campaigns on the continent, typically from late spring through early autumn, everything changed. During these months, Mary was not merely a regent acting in her husband's name. She was the sovereign, with full authority to govern the kingdom. She presided over the cabinet council, made decisions on domestic policy, managed relations with Parliament, and dealt with emergencies as they arose. This alternating pattern, William in control when present, Mary in control when he was absent, continued throughout their joint reign. Mary approached her periods of solo rule with a mixture of reluctance and determination. She never claimed to want power for its own sake, and she found the responsibilities of government burdensome. "I am left here with the weight of the whole kingdom upon my shoulders," she wrote to William during his absence in 1690. Yet she also took her duties seriously and worked hard to fulfill them competently. The cabinet council that advised Mary during William's absences consisted of 9 members, representing both political parties and various factions. Managing this council required considerable skill. The members often disagreed with each other, sometimes violently, and Mary had to mediate disputes, build consensus, and make final decisions when consensus proved impossible. She learned to listen carefully to all sides, to ask probing questions, and to avoid being manipulated by any single faction. One of Mary's most important responsibilities during her solo periods was maintaining good relations with Parliament. The ongoing war against France required enormous sums of money, which Parliament had to approve through taxation. William was often impatient with Parliament's delays and debates, but Mary understood better the need to cultivate parliamentary support. She attended sessions of the House of Lords when important matters were being debated, showed respect for parliamentary procedures, and worked behind the scenes to build support for the government's requests. Mary also had to deal with military matters during William's absence, which was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her solo rule. She was not trained in military affairs and had no direct experience of warfare, yet she had to make decisions about troop deployments, supply lines, and strategic priorities. She relied heavily on military advisors, but she also educated herself, studying maps and reading dispatches so that she could understand the issues and ask intelligent questions. The summer of 1690, when William was in Ireland fighting against James II's forces, was particularly trying for Mary. She had to manage the government while knowing that her husband was in battle against her father, that she might receive news at any moment that one or both of them had been killed. The moral complexity of the situation, supporting an army fighting against her own father, weighed heavily on her conscience. Yet she fulfilled her duties, authorizing supplies for William's army, maintaining order in England, and presenting a confident face to the public. One of the most difficult decisions Mary had to make during William's absence involved dealing with plots and conspiracies. The Jacobite threat remained real throughout the reign, with agents of James II working to undermine the government and prepare for his restoration. Mary had to authorize arrests, interrogations, and sometimes executions of conspirators. These decisions troubled her deeply. She hated the thought of sending anyone to death, but she convinced herself that the security of Protestant England required firmness against traitors. The incident that most damaged Mary's reputation involved her uncle, Henry Hyde, Earl of Clarendon. He was arrested in 1690 on suspicion of conspiring to restore James II. Mary authorized his arrest despite his family connection to her, and though he was eventually released without trial for lack of evidence, the episode shocked contemporaries. How could she arrest her own uncle? But Mary saw it as her duty. Personal loyalty had to give way to the security of the state. An even more painful episode involved the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. John Churchill, Earl, later Duke, of Marlborough, was one of England's finest generals and had been instrumental in William's successful invasion. But in 1692, evidence emerged suggesting that Marlborough might be secretly corresponding with James II in France, possibly contemplating switching sides. Mary ordered his dismissal from all military and civil offices. This decision had explosive personal consequences because Marlborough's wife Sarah was Anne's closest friend and confidant. Anne saw Mary's action as a personal attack and refused to dismiss Sarah from her own household. The confrontation between the sisters escalated until Anne left court entirely, choosing Sarah's friendship over her sister's wishes. Mary felt she had no choice. The security of the realm had to take precedence over family harmony, but the breach with Anne caused her profound grief. Despite these challenges and sorrows, Mary developed into an effective ruler. She had a remarkable ability to focus on detail while not losing sight of larger principles. She read every document presented to her carefully, often late into the night, making notes and asking for clarifications. She kept herself informed about developments in Parliament, at court, and in the country at large. She cultivated a network of informants who kept her apprised of public opinion and potential problems. Mary also showed considerable skill in managing people. She knew how to be gracious without being weak, firm without being harsh. She could be charming when necessary, winning over skeptics through personal warmth and dignity. but she could also be steely when the situation required it, standing firm on principles even when pressured to compromise. This combination of personal charm and moral firmness made her an effective leader. In ecclesiastical matters, Mary exercised particularly strong influence throughout the reign, not just during William's absences. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she took seriously her responsibility for the spiritual health of the nation. She was deeply involved in the appointment of bishops and other senior clergy, insisting on candidates who combined theological learning with genuine piety and moral character. Mary's vision for the Church of England was of an institution that would be both intellectually rigorous and spiritually vital. She supported efforts to improve clerical education, to enforce discipline among the clergy, and to combat both irreligion and enthusiasm, religious fanaticism. She believed that the Church should be a force for moral reformation in society, teaching people to live virtuous lives in accordance with Christian principles. This moral vision extended beyond the Church to society as a whole. Mary used her position to promote what we might today call a culture war against vice and immorality. She issued royal proclamations against swearing, drunkenness, and sexual license. She supported societies dedicated to reforming manners and promoting virtue. She used her influence at court to discourage gambling, theatre-going, and other activities she considered frivolous or corrupting. Not everyone appreciated Mary's moral crusading. Many at court found her rules oppressive and complained that she had taken all the fun out of royal life. The theatre was in decline because courtiers knew the Queen disapproved of plays. Dancing and parties became more sedate and less frequent. Even fashion became more modest, as ladies knew that appearing in revealing gowns would incur the Queen's disapproval. But Mary was unmoved by such complaints. She believed that as Queen, she had a responsibility before God to set a good example and to use her influence for righteousness. She could not force people to be virtuous, but she could at least ensure that vice was not openly celebrated and rewarded. And many of her subjects appreciated her efforts, seeing in Mary a queen who took her Christian duties seriously and who tried to lead the nation in godly paths. Mary's relationship with William during these years continued to deepen and mature. Their marriage had evolved from the cold formality of the early years into genuine partnership and affection. They had learned to work together effectively, each respecting the other's strengths and compensating for the other's weaknesses. William relied increasingly on Mary's judgment, particularly in matters relating to England's domestic politics and the Church. Mary, in turn, had come to admire and love her husband deeply, seeing past his cold exterior to the devoted and principled man beneath. Their correspondence during William's absences reveals the depth of their bond. Mary's letters to William were filled with expressions of love, with concern for his health and safety, with prayers for his success. "I love you with a passion," she wrote in one letter, "that perhaps is not suitable to my dignity, but certainly very agreeable to the sincerity of my soul." William's replies were shorter and less emotionally demonstrative, as befitted his character, but they showed genuine affection and trust. He shared military and political information with her, sought her advice, and expressed his eagerness to return to her. The times when William returned from campaign were occasions of genuine joy for Mary. She would go to meet him at the coast or at the palace gates, her face lighting up at the sight of him. They would embrace, not with the formal restraint expected of monarchs, but with real warmth and relief. The court would note the Queen's happiness and comment on how her whole demeanour changed when the king was present. Yet even in these moments of happiness, there were shadows. William's health was never good. His asthma and chronic cough made him vulnerable to respiratory infections, and the strain of military campaigns exhausted him. Mary worried constantly about his health, urging him to take better care of himself, though she knew he would never spare himself as long as duty called. There was also the knowledge that each campaign might be his last, that he might be killed in battle or die of disease in the military camp. Every time William left for war, Mary had to face the possibility that she might never see him again. She would spend the months of his absence in a state of barely suppressed anxiety, starting at every messenger's arrival, fearing that they brought news of disaster. And there was the continuing pain of her father's exile. James II lived on in France, a pensioner of Louis XIV, plotting futilely to regain his throne. He sent occasional letters to Mary, mixing reproaches with appeals to family feeling, asking how she could live in peace on a throne stolen from him. Mary could not bring herself to read these letters, let alone reply to them. She told herself that her father's exile was necessary, that she had acted righteously, but the guilt never entirely went away. The years of joint rule also brought ongoing tension with Anne. The sisters remained estranged, living in the same city but never meeting, communicating only through formal written messages when state business required it. Mary felt this estrangement keenly. She had lost so much: her mother in childhood, her father through political necessity, and now her sister through personal conflict. She was queen of 3 kingdoms, but felt herself to be profoundly alone, except for William. Yet Mary persevered. She continued to fulfill her duties as queen with conscientiousness and grace. She ruled effectively during William's absences, supported him loyally when he was present, promoted moral reformation, patronized the arts and architecture, maintained the dignity of the crown, and tried to be faithful to the Protestant principles that had cost her so much. She had never wanted to be queen, but having accepted the crown, she was determined to wear it worthily. By late 1694, Mary had been queen for nearly 6 years. She had survived political crises, plots, and conspiracies. She had governed effectively both alone and in partnership with William. She had earned the respect and even the love of many of her subjects, but she was tired. Tired of the burdens of power, tired of the conflicts and intrigues of court, tired of living with guilt and sorrow. She was only 32 years old, but sometimes she felt much older, worn down by responsibilities and sorrows. She could not have known, as 1694 drew toward its close, that she had only weeks left to live. The winter that was approaching would be her last, and the crown she had worn for 6 years would soon pass entirely to William. But before the end came, Mary would face her final trial with the same courage and faith that had characterized her entire life, showing the world one last time what it meant to be a queen of true nobility and grace. The autumn of 1694 found Mary in a reflective mood, looking back over the years of her reign and forward to an uncertain future. The war against France continued with no end in sight, draining England's treasury and consuming men and resources. The political situation remained complex, with factions at court maneuvering for advantage and Parliament growing increasingly assertive in demanding accountability from the Crown. And Mary's personal life remained marked by the sorrows of estrangement from her sister and the burden of guilt over her father. Yet there were also moments of quiet satisfaction and even contentment. Mary had proven herself capable of rule and had earned widespread respect from her subjects. The people saw in her a queen who was genuinely pious, morally upright, and dedicated to their welfare. Unlike William, who was admired for his military skill, but never quite accepted as truly English, Mary was beloved as one of their own, a Stuart princess who represented continuity with England's past, even as she led the nation into a new constitutional settlement. Mary's daily routine during this period continued to reflect her methodical and dutiful nature. She still rose early for private devotions, still attended carefully to the business of government, still presided over court functions with grace and dignity, but she also allowed herself small pleasures that had been denied her in the busier, more stressful early years of her reign. She spent more time in her gardens at Kensington Palace, which had been transformed under her direction into one of the finest royal gardens in England. She had created a Dutch garden with formal geometric patterns reminiscent of the gardens she had loved in the Netherlands, but had also added English elements: wildflower meadows, shady groves, and winding paths. Walking in these gardens, particularly in the early morning when the dew was still on the grass and the birdsong filled the air, Mary could find brief respites from the pressures of queenship. She also devoted more time to her collections and artistic patronage. Her passion for Chinese and Japanese porcelain had grown into one of the finest collections in Europe, with pieces displayed in specially designed chambers at both Kensington and Hampton Court. She took genuine pleasure in acquiring new pieces, examining them carefully, and arranging them for maximum aesthetic effect. This might seem trivial compared to the weighty matters of state, but for Mary, these moments of aesthetic appreciation were necessary for maintaining her emotional and spiritual equilibrium. Mary's relationship with William during this final autumn was perhaps at its deepest and most satisfying. They had been married for 17 years, and the initial coldness and formality had long since given way to genuine intimacy and partnership. William had learned to value Mary's counsel and to rely on her judgment. Mary, in turn, had come to understand and appreciate William's character, seeing past his reserve to the integrity and dedication beneath. When William was present, they would often spend quiet evenings together after the formal duties of the day were complete. William would work on correspondence or review military plans, while Mary read or did needlework nearby. They didn't always talk. William was not given to idle conversation, but the companionship was comfortable, the silence shared rather than isolating. Occasionally, Mary would read passages from her devotional books aloud, and William would pause in his work to listen, finding in her words something of the spiritual comfort he himself rarely sought directly. The estrangement from Anne continued to pain Mary throughout this period. The sisters had not spoken or met for over 2 years, despite living in close proximity, and despite the fact that Anne was heir presumptive to the throne. The breach had become a public scandal, with satirists and pamphleteers commenting on the unnatural division between the royal sisters. But neither Mary nor Anne seemed able or willing to bridge the gap. In April 1694, Anne suffered another of her heartbreaking pregnancy losses, a miscarriage that left her physically weakened and emotionally devastated. When Mary heard the news, her first impulse was to go to Anne immediately, to offer comfort and sympathy. She actually prepared to visit, ordering her carriage made ready. But then pride and resentment reasserted themselves. Anne had chosen Sarah Churchill over her own sister. Let Sarah comfort her now. Yet Mary's decision not to visit gnawed at her conscience. She knew it was uncharitable, knew that Christian duty required her to show compassion even to those who had wronged her. After Anne recovered from the miscarriage and its immediate aftermath, Mary did send a brief note expressing her sympathy. The note was formal and cool, but it was at least an acknowledgement. Anne sent an equally formal reply. It was not a reconciliation, but it was perhaps a first small step toward one, though neither sister could have known that there would be no time for the journey to be completed. Throughout 1694, Mary also had to confront increasingly disturbing reports about her father's situation in France. James II, now in his early 60s, was growing old and increasingly frail. His hopes of restoration had faded as English support for his cause evaporated, and Louis XIV's attention shifted to other strategic priorities. James lived in a kind of gentle, captivity at the French court, going through the motions of being a king in exile, but increasingly aware that he would never reclaim his throne. Mary tried not to think too much about her father, but she could not entirely suppress her feelings of guilt and sorrow. She told herself repeatedly that she had done the right thing, that her duty to her faith and her nation had required her to support William's invasion. She reminded herself of James's stubborn refusal to compromise, his determination to restore Catholicism regardless of the cost, his willingness to bring in French troops to suppress English liberties. She had acted righteously, hadn't she? But late at night, when she was alone with her thoughts and her prayers, doubts crept in. Had there been another way? Could she have done more to prevent the breach? Would God forgive her for helping to drive her own father into exile? These questions haunted Mary, and she found no easy answers. She sought solace in prayer and in the assurances of her chaplains that she had acted rightly, but complete peace of mind eluded her. Mary's religious life remained central to her existence throughout this final year. She continued to spend hours each day in private devotions, reading scripture and books of theology and piety. She kept a spiritual journal where she recorded her struggles with sin, particularly with pride, which she saw as her besetting weakness, and her efforts to cultivate Christian virtues. She examined her conscience rigorously, holding herself to standards of moral perfection that no human could possibly achieve, and then flagellating herself emotionally when she inevitably fell short. This intense religiosity might seem excessive or even unhealthy to modern sensibilities, but for Mary, it was simply what serious Christianity demanded. She lived in an age that took religion with deadly seriousness, when questions of doctrine and practice were matters of life and death. Her faith gave her life meaning and purpose. It provided a framework for understanding her experiences and making sense of her sufferings. Without that faith, the burden she carried might have crushed her entirely. In the autumn of 1694, Mary also became increasingly concerned about the succession. She was 32 years old and had been married for 17 years without producing a living child. It was now clear that she would never bear children. This meant that Anne was heir to the throne, and after Anne, Anne's children. But Anne's children kept dying. She had been pregnant repeatedly, but had never had a child survive past infancy. If both Mary and Anne died without heirs, the succession would fall to distant Protestant relatives, creating potential instability and crisis. Parliament was beginning to discuss the succession question openly, which troubled Mary. She felt that such discussions were premature and disrespectful. After all, she and William were still alive and relatively young, but the fertile concerns were real, and Mary knew that the lack of an heir was one of the few genuine weaknesses in the Protestant succession established by the Glorious Revolution. Throughout the autumn, Mary maintained her usual schedule of duties and activities, giving no outward sign that anything was amiss. She attended council meetings, received foreign ambassadors, presided over court functions, and tended to the myriad details of royal administration. She seemed to be in reasonably good health, though friends noted that she sometimes appeared tired and that she had grown thin, her naturally slender figure becoming almost gaunt. In late November, Mary began planning for the Christmas season. She wanted to host elaborate celebrations at court, both to maintain royal traditions and to provide some cheer during the dark days of winter. She ordered special music to be composed, arranged for decorations to be made, and planned menus for the feasts. She looked forward to William's presence during the holidays. He would be home from the military front, and they could enjoy the season together. But Mary would not live to see Christmas. The winter that was approaching would bring not celebration, but tragedy, as the Queen, who had survived so many trials and sorrows, would fall victim to one of the age's most feared diseases. Her final weeks of life would test her courage and faith one last time, and she would meet that test with the same dignity and grace that had characterized her entire reign. In early December, as the weather turned cold and damp, Mary was still going about her usual activities, unaware that time was running out. She walked in her gardens despite the chill, attended to her correspondence, and prepared for the season ahead. The great palace of Kensington, which she had worked so hard to beautify, would soon become the scene of her final struggle. But for now, in these last days of health and life, Mary went about her duties with her customary diligence, trying to serve her God, her husband, and her kingdom to the best of her ability. The 19th of December 1694 began as an ordinary day in the life of Queen Mary II. She rose at her usual hour, conducted her morning devotions, and dressed with the help of her ladies. She attended to some correspondence and met with a few officials about routine matters. Nothing about the day seemed particularly ominous or significant, but by evening, Mary was not feeling well. She complained of a headache and general malaise, symptoms that might have been dismissed as simply fatigue or a mild cold. Over the next few days, Mary's condition worsened. The headache intensified. She developed a fever, and she began to feel severe pains throughout her body. On the 22nd of December, distinctive red spots began to appear on her skin, first on her face, then spreading to her body. The physicians examined these spots with growing alarm and delivered their devastating diagnosis: smallpox. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the era, a killer that struck across all social classes and showed no mercy. It spread rapidly through communities, killing perhaps a third of those it infected, and leaving survivors often scarred and sometimes blind. There was no cure, no effective treatment, nothing that could be done except to make the patient as comfortable as possible and pray for recovery. Even the king's physicians, with all their learning and experience, were helpless before this disease. Mary received the diagnosis with remarkable calm. She had always known that death might come suddenly. She had seen it happen too often in her own family. Her mother had died when Mary was 9. Multiple siblings had died in infancy. Anne's children died one after another. Death was not some distant abstraction, but an ever-present reality, and Mary's religious faith had prepared her to face it. Her first action upon learning she had smallpox was characteristically thoughtful of others. She immediately ordered that anyone who had not previously had the disease should leave her presence to avoid infection. She would not allow her illness to endanger others if she could prevent it. Her ladies-in-waiting and servants who had survived smallpox themselves were allowed to remain to care for her, but all others had to depart. William was devastated by the news. For all his reserve and emotional restraint, he had come to love Mary deeply over their 17 years of marriage. She was the one person in the world he truly trusted, the one whose presence gave him comfort and peace. The thought of losing her was almost unbearable. He immediately cancelled all his other activities and came to be with her, sitting by her bedside for hours, holding her hand, speaking to her softly. Mary's sister Anne, upon hearing that the Queen was gravely ill, immediately wrote offering to come to her despite the risk of infection. Anne was pregnant again. She was always either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy loss, but she was willing to risk both her own health and that of her unborn child to see her sister one last time. The letter shows that beneath all the political and personal conflicts, genuine sisterly love still existed, but Mary refused Anne's offer. Through her attendants, she sent word that Anne should not come, should not expose herself to the contagion. It was a decision made partly out of concern for Anne's welfare and partly perhaps, out of pride. Mary did not want Anne to see her disfigured by disease, did not want their final meeting to be marked by pity. The two sisters would never see each other again. A tragic ending to a relationship that had survived so much, but ultimately could not overcome the strains placed upon it. As the smallpox progressed, Mary's condition deteriorated rapidly. The spots that had first appeared developed into pustules, painful eruptions that covered her face and body. The fever intensified, bringing delirium and confusion. She suffered terribly, though she tried to bear the pain with patience and dignity. When she was lucid, she would pray aloud, recite passages of Scripture, and speak of her readiness to meet her Maker. The physicians did what little they could, which amounted mainly to bleeding her, a treatment that almost certainly weakened her further, and applying various poultices and medicines that had no real efficacy. They consulted with each other gravely, shaking their heads, offering no hope. The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned to administer the last rites and to offer spiritual comfort. Mary faced her approaching death with extraordinary courage and faith. She took communion, confessed her sins, and arranged her spiritual affairs with the same methodical attention to detail she had brought to everything else in her life. She spoke to the Archbishop about her doubts and fears, particularly her guilt over her father's exile. The Archbishop assured her that she had acted rightly, that her duty to God and to Protestant England had required the choices she made. Mary wanted desperately to believe this, and she found some comfort in the Archbishop's words. She also made practical arrangements, dictating codicils to her will and leaving instructions for her burial. She wanted a simple funeral, she said, without excessive pomp or expense. She left instructions for the distribution of her personal property, her jewels, her clothes, her collections of porcelain and books. She asked that her spiritual journal be destroyed, not wanting her private struggles with God to be made public. She thought of everyone, taking care of details even as her strength ebbed away. William was with her almost constantly during these final days. He had a bed set up in her room so that he could stay close to her throughout the nights. Those who saw them together reported that the famously cold and reserved William was openly weeping, unable to maintain his usual composure in the face of losing the woman he loved. He held Mary's hand for hours, speaking to her softly when she was conscious, sitting silently beside her when she slept or raved in delirium. On the night of December 27th, Mary seemed to rally slightly. She was lucid and able to speak with relative clarity. She and William had a long, private conversation. What passed between them, no one else ever knew, but it seems likely that they spoke of their life together, of regrets and gratitude, of love that had grown slowly, but had become genuine and deep. Mary told William not to grieve too long for her, that he must continue his work defending Protestant Europe against French tyranny. William could barely speak for weeping. Mary also asked to see some of her closest attendants to say goodbye. She thanked them for their faithful service, gave them personal mementos, and asked them to pray for her soul. She apologized for being sometimes sharp or demanding. She knew she could be difficult when the pressures of queenship weighed heavily on her. She faced death with the same grace and dignity that had characterized her life, thinking of others even in her own extremity. As morning approached on December 28th, Mary began to fail rapidly. The physician, checking her pulse, found it growing weaker and more irregular. Her breathing became labored and shallow. William, who had briefly left the room to rest, was summoned back urgently. He arrived to find Mary barely conscious, her eyes unable to focus, her hand growing cold in his. Mary's last intelligible words were a prayer, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then she slipped into unconsciousness, from which she would not wake. William knelt beside the bed, still holding her hand, weeping openly now with no attempt to control his grief. The assembled courtiers and servants stood in respectful silence, many of them crying as well, as they watched their queen slip away. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon on December 28th, 1694, Mary II, Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland, breathed her last. She was 32 years old. She had been queen for not quite 6 years. She had never borne a living child. She died estranged from her father and barely reconciled with her sister. But she died secure in her Protestant faith, surrounded by those who respected and cared for her, and holding the hand of the husband she had learned to love deeply. At the moment of her death, bells throughout London began to toll, a slow, solemn ringing that announced to the city that the Queen was gone. The sound of those bells carried across the Thames, through the streets and alleyways, bringing the news to every corner of the capital. People stopped in their activities, removed their hats, and offered prayers for the soul of their departed queen. Shops closed their doors. Taverns fell silent. Throughout the city, there was a genuine outpouring of grief. William was so devastated that he collapsed and had to be helped from the room. For days afterward, he remained in seclusion, refusing to see anyone, barely eating, seemingly inconsolable in his grief. From being the happiest man alive, he reportedly said, "I am now the miserablest creature on earth." For a man so famously reserved and controlled, this display of emotion was remarkable and showed how deeply Mary's death affected him. Mary's body was embalmed and lay in state at Kensington Palace for several weeks, giving people time to pay their respects. Thousands came to view the Queen's coffin, filing past in somber silence, many weeping openly. Mary had been genuinely beloved by her people, and their grief was sincere. She represented everything they valued: piety, moral rectitude, devotion to Protestant principles, dedication to duty. In her death, as in her life, she was an example of what a queen should be. The smallpox that killed Mary had struck without warning and without mercy. She had survived revolution, political crisis, personal betrayals, and years of pressure and responsibility, only to fall victim to a disease that respected neither rank nor virtue. Her death was a reminder of life's fundamental uncertainty, of the fact that despite all our planning and all our power, we remain vulnerable to forces beyond our control. Mary understood this. Her faith had taught her to accept the sovereignty of God and the limitations of human will. She died as she had lived, trusting in divine providence even when she could not understand it. The death of Queen Mary II sent shockwaves not just through England, but across Protestant Europe. She had been more than just a monarch. She had been a symbol of Protestant resistance to Catholic France, a living embodiment of the Glorious Revolution's principles, and a genuinely beloved figure whose moral character had commanded widespread respect. Her passing left a void that would be felt for years to come. The funeral arrangements became a matter of state importance. Despite Mary's request for simplicity, it was decided that the occasion demanded full royal ceremony. The funeral would be the grandest England had seen in generations, a demonstration of national grief and a celebration of Mary's life and reign. The date was set for March 5th, 1695, more than 2 months after her death, to allow time for elaborate preparations. During the weeks between Mary's death and her funeral, her body lay in state in Kensington Palace. The room was draped entirely in black, with hundreds of candles burning around the coffin, creating a solemn and dramatic scene. Guards stood watch day and night. Visitors were admitted in carefully controlled groups to pay their respects, and thousands came, nobles and commoners alike, all wanting to say goodbye to their queen. The public response to Mary's death revealed just how popular she had been. Sermons were preached across the country, praising her virtues and lamenting her loss. Poets composed elegies celebrating her life. Pamphlets and broadsides appeared recounting her good deeds and godly character. The genuine outpouring of grief was remarkable and showed that Mary, unlike her husband, had truly captured the hearts of the English people. William's response to Mary's death was one of profound and lasting grief. He who had been so reserved and emotionally contained throughout his life was undone by the loss of his wife. He withdrew from public life as much as his royal duties would allow, spending hours alone in the rooms they had shared. He commissioned a portrait of Mary that he kept in his private chambers, and he wore a locket containing a lock of her hair for the rest of his life. William also honoured Mary's memory by completing projects she had begun. The gardens at Kensington that she had loved so much were finished according to her designs. The renovations at Hampton Court Palace that they had planned together were completed. It was William's way of keeping Mary's presence alive, of maintaining some connection to the woman who had been his companion and partner for 17 years. The funeral itself, when it finally took place on March 5th, was a magnificent affair. London had never seen anything quite like it. The procession began at Whitehall Palace and proceeded through streets lined with thousands of mourners. The coffin was carried on an open hearse draped in purple velvet and drawn by 6 horses, also draped in black. Walking behind were more than 500 members of Parliament, privy councillors, judges, nobles, and other dignitaries, all dressed in mourning black. Notably absent from the procession was William himself. He was too overcome with grief to attend and remained in seclusion at Kensington Palace. His absence was understood and forgiven. Everyone knew how deeply he had loved Mary and how devastated he was by her loss. Anne also did not attend, being in the final stages of another pregnancy that would, like so many before, end in tragedy. The procession moved slowly through the streets to Westminster Abbey, where the funeral service would be held. Henry Purcell, England's greatest composer, had been commissioned to write music for the occasion. His Music for the Funeral of Queen Mary is still recognized as one of the masterpieces of Baroque music, hauntingly beautiful and profoundly moving. The piece captured perfectly the mood of the day, somber, yet not without hope, grieving, yet also celebrating a life well lived. Inside Westminster Abbey, packed with mourners, the service proceeded with all the ancient ceremony of the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury preached a sermon praising Mary's virtues, her piety, her charity, her moral courage, her dedication to duty. He spoke of how she had faced the difficult choice between father and faith and had chosen faith, a decision that the Archbishop assured the congregation was righteous and pleasing to God. He painted a picture of Mary now in heaven, reunited with her mother and siblings, freed from the burdens of earthly crown and earthly suffering. After the service, Mary's coffin was carried to the vault beneath the Abbey's Lady Chapel, where she would be laid to rest. She was buried near her mother, Anne Hyde, and near other members of the Stuart family. A magnificent monument would later be erected to her memory, though it would be years before William could bring himself to commission it. The pain of loss was too fresh, too raw. In the days and weeks following the funeral, the reality of Mary's absence began to sink in. The court, which she had worked so hard to reform and make moral, began to slip back toward the looser standards of earlier reigns. Without Mary's influence, William had little interest in maintaining the strict moral code she had imposed. The nation continued to function, but many felt that something essential had been lost, a moral centre, a living example of Protestant virtue. For William, ruling alone proved to be both easier and harder than ruling jointly. It was easier in that he no longer had to consult with anyone or compromise on decisions. His word was now law, but it was harder emotionally. He missed Mary's counsel, her judgment, her support. He missed her presence, the comfort of knowing she was there. He had never been a warm or personable man, and without Mary to soften his image and connect him to the English people, he became increasingly isolated and unpopular. William would rule alone for just over 7 years after Mary's death. He never remarried. He remained faithful to Mary's memory, speaking of her often and always with evident emotion. When he died in 1702 from complications following a fall from his horse, his last request was to be buried beside Mary in Westminster Abbey. His wishes were honoured, and the couple who had ruled jointly in life were reunited in death. The throne passed to Anne, as had been predetermined by the Act of Succession. Anne ruled for 12 years, longer than either Mary or William. But Anne too died without surviving children, and the crown then passed to the House of Hanover, as provided for in the Act of Settlement that had been passed during William and Mary's reign. The Stuart line, which had ruled England and Scotland for over a century, came to an end. Mary's legacy extended far beyond her brief reign. The Glorious Revolution, which she had helped to secure, fundamentally transformed English government. The constitutional monarchy established by William and Mary's accession to the throne, with its Bill of Rights limiting royal power and establishing parliamentary supremacy, became the model for British government that continues to this day. The principle that monarchs rule not by divine right, but by consent of the governed, formalized during Mary's reign, was revolutionary and would influence democratic movements around the world. Mary's role in establishing this constitutional settlement has sometimes been overlooked by historians who focus on William's military and diplomatic achievements. But Mary's contribution was significant. Her hereditary claim gave legitimacy to the revolution. Her popularity with the English people helped secure acceptance of the new regime. Her effective rule during William's absences demonstrated that the new constitutional arrangements could work in practice. Without Mary, the Glorious Revolution might have turned into just another contested succession crisis, rather than a permanent transformation of English government. Mary's personal character also left a lasting impression. She was remembered as a model of female virtue, pious, dutiful, moral, charitable. For generations afterward, she was held up as an example of what a Christian woman and a Christian queen should be. Sunday school lessons taught children about Queen Mary's devotion to prayer. Sermons invoked her as an example of choosing God over worldly considerations. She became, in effect, a tearful Protestant saint, though Protestants don't officially recognize saints. This idealized image of Mary, while based on real virtues, also obscured some of the complexity of her actual character and situation. The real Mary had doubts and struggles. She had made choices that caused her anguish. She had lived with guilt and grief that the triumphant narratives of Protestant historiography tended to gloss over. She was more human, more complicated, and in some ways more admirable than the simplified saint of later legend. Modern historians have worked to recover this more nuanced view of Mary, seeing her not just as William's wife, or as a symbol of Protestant virtue, but as a significant figure in her own right. She was a woman who exercised real political power in an age when such power was normally reserved for men. She was a joint sovereign who helped govern effectively during a crucial period in English history. She was a patron of arts and architecture who left a lasting mark on England's cultural landscape. And she was a human being who faced extraordinary challenges with courage, faith, and grace. The College of William and Mary in Virginia, founded in 1693, stands as a lasting tribute to the joint reign. It was the second institution of higher learning established in English America, and it bore both monarchs' names in recognition of their charter, granting it royal status. The college continues to operate today, more than 3 centuries later, a living connection to Mary's reign and influence. Perhaps Mary's most important legacy, though, is the simple example of her life, how she faced difficult choices with integrity, how she grew from a frightened girl into a capable ruler, how she balanced duty with conscience, how she loved faithfully and ruled wisely. She showed that power could be exercised with moral principle, that difficult circumstances need not result in moral compromise, that it was possible to be both strong and compassionate, both dutiful and humane. In the end, Mary II's life was both a triumph and a tragedy. She triumphed by fulfilling duties she never sought with grace and effectiveness. She established a model of Protestant monarchy that would endure. She showed that a woman could rule wisely and well. She transformed from a reluctant bride into a beloved queen. But the triumph came at tremendous personal cost. The loss of her father's love, estrangement from her sister, the guilt that never entirely left her, and finally, a death that came far too soon, cutting short a life that still had so much to offer. As the years passed and the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Mary's memory was honored, but gradually faded from immediate consciousness. Other monarchs, other crises, other transformations captured the nation's attention, but her influence remained, woven into the fabric of English constitutional government, visible in the buildings she had commissioned and the institutions she had supported, present in the principles of limited monarchy and parliamentary supremacy that she had helped to establish. And for those who took the time to study her life and understand her choices, Mary remained an inspiring figure, a woman who had faced impossible dilemmas with courage, who had chosen duty over desire, who had loved faithfully despite disappointments, and who had served her God and her people to the very end. She was a queen who never wanted power, but who wielded it wisely when called upon to do so. She was a daughter who loved her father but could not follow him into error. She was a woman of deep faith who tried to live by her principles even when they cost her dearly. And she was, in the end, simply human, flawed, struggling, and yet somehow noble in her very imperfection. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the life of Mary II, from that April morning in 1662, when she entered the world as a royal princess, through her childhood marked by loss and her marriage to a stranger, through her years in the Netherlands and her transformation into a beloved queen, to that cold December day in 1694, when smallpox claimed her life at the age of 32. Mary's story is one of duty chosen over desire, of love that grew slowly but became genuine, of faith tested by impossible choices. She never sought power, but wielded it wisely when circumstances demanded. She faced the heartbreak of betraying her father for the sake of her principles and her nation. She endured the loneliness of estrangement from her sister. She bore the sorrow of childlessness and the weight of a crown she had never wanted. Yet through it all, she maintained her dignity, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to what she believed was right. Her legacy extends far beyond her brief 6-year reign. The constitutional monarchy she helped establish still forms the basis of British government today. The principle that rulers must govern according to law and with the consent of the governed, a principle secured by the Glorious Revolution, became foundational to democratic movements around the world. And her personal example of moral courage and faithful service continues to inspire those who study her life. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you might remember Queen Mary walking in her beloved gardens at Kensington Palace, finding moments of peace amid the storms of political life, or Mary at her prayers, seeking divine guidance for the difficult decisions she faced, or Mary holding William's hand as they ruled together, two very different people who learned to love and trust each other. or Mary facing death with courage and faith, secure in her belief that she had done her best to serve God and her people. Sleep well, dear listener. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Mary's story, or perhaps telling me which historical figure you'd like to explore next in our Sleepy Crown family. Your likes and subscriptions help these videos reach more people who find comfort in history's gentle tales. Thank you for spending these hours with me, learning about a queen who shaped a revolution and whose choices still echo through the centuries. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed and ready for whatever tomorrow brings. Until we meet again in another corner of history, this is Sleepy Crown, wishing you the sweetest of dreams. Good night.